Good morning.
Good morning.
How's everybody this morning?
Alive?
Alive. Okay, I like that answer. Alive. Well, welcome. My name is Scott Tinsman, and along with my cousin Hub, who's out in the back, we'd like to welcome you to today's presentation. It's our pleasure and honor to be running Liqui-Grow for the last 30 years. Our fathers started this three-generation family business about 65 years ago with the sole purpose of trying to give advice or at least give odds out there on how to help farmers maximize their profit per acre. If you look at our fertility programs, our placement, our timing, chemical programs, now we've gone past GPS and variable rate, and we're into biologicals and studying those. Today's program is just another extension of that. The carbon credit market is definitely changing, and it seems to be changing almost weekly. Today's the best information we have to point. If we have a session again next year, I'm sure we'll be building on it. So without further ado, the key to today's program is we want to give the best advice possible because we don't want anybody going backwards. Again, the goal is for you guys to be successful. If you're successful, we'll be successful. So without further ado, Dr. Jake Bossenkemper will moderate today's program. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it very much. So, a couple folks I want to introduce is Peter with JJ Nicotine here. Hey, Peter. I talked to you on the phone yesterday. I haven't met you in person, but Peter with JJ Nicotine's here. They have a strip freshener out in the parking lot, from my understanding. It's a iteration of a strip till machine. If you'd like to know what the difference is between a strip till machine or a strip freshener, talk to Peter there with JJ Nicotine. He'll fill you in. So we also had another guest that was going to be here today, but she called me and said that she was vomiting in her pickup. She's one of our cover crop suppliers. So she turned around and went home, and it's unfortunate she cannot be here today because she's very sharp at cover crops and cover crop blends, and she would have been a very informative person to have here today, but unfortunately, like I said, she can't make it. So before we get started, I have something that I'd like to share. I was going to save it for my presentation, but I think it's important to kick off the meeting today with a thank you. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal roughly a month ago, and the article was all about the potential upsides to conservation from the American agricultural industrial complex. It's a great article in the Wall Street Journal. If you can get a hold of the article, you ought to read it. And basically the article says that, look, since the 1950s, the American ag industry, including the American farmer, has tripled corn yields. We've tripled corn yields since the 1950s. We're using less nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium fertilizer today than ever before in history. So we've been able to do that using less fertilizer. We're using less pesticides, fewer herbicides, doing less tillage. So everything about the American agricultural industrial complex is in a better place than it ever was before in history. We fed the world, frankly. And when people talk about organic agriculture and that that farmers are polluters, I think they need to think about the fact that if we didn't triple corn yields in the U.S., think about how much more of the world and the rainforest would be basically dedicated to agricultural production today. So because of our efficiencies, we've actually done a lot of good for the world and for the environment. And what we're going to talk about today is another call for the world in this country, another call to action for farmers to now help us tackle climate change. So I think we all deserve a round of applause on the achievements that we've been able to achieve with the American ag and our ability to feed this country and the rest of the world. And I might add that you can eat cheaper in America than you can any other country on the face of the planet. That's, again, attested to what we've done with American agriculture. So we should all be proud of ourselves. With that, we're going to introduce our first speaker today, Mariah with Land O'Lakes in Truterra. So Mariah is a senior manager with Truterra and Land O'Lakes, and she's going to talk to us about the Truterra ecosystems market and the specifics around that program. And we're proud to announce that we're officially partnered with Truterra to bring these offerings to our customers. So, Mariah? I told her I was going to call her Miranda. My sister-in-law's name is Miranda, so it's going to be impossible.
Is it good?
He says it.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. Perfect. Well, yeah, first and foremost, Mariah Murphy with Truterra. So I've been with Land O'Lakes for about 9 years now. It's a little awkward, like presenting in front of a group. I haven't been out since COVID's really started, so this is only my second meeting. So forgive me as I get used to back to the more of the normalcies that we've had in the past. But what we're going to talk about today is just a couple things. So we're going to talk about a general overview of what Truterra is and what Land O'Lakes is doing in terms of sustainability. And then we're going to move into more of what does our carbon credit market look like. And so as we talk about Truterra in general, we are the 4th business unit of Land O'Lakes. Okay, so everyone's familiar with the dairy business, familiar with the Winfield United side, Purina, but then there's a sustainability business that came from the result of the merger between United Suppliers and Winfield United. And so with that sustainability business, Land O'Lakes said, okay, like it's time to have a sustainability unit. And so today there's 16 of us within this business unit, and we all operate across the United States. There's 5 of us in the field that cover about 33 accounts today. So at Truterra, what we're really focused on is how do we support the profitability and the resiliency of farmers, all while protecting those natural resources, right? And so we have been very consistent in our messaging that if, you know, trying to do a carbon credit or trying to do a water quality credit is not going to be profitable for you and your operation, then we don't want you to do it, right? While we do want to continue down the path of, you know, pushing ourselves to more of a sustainability marketplace, we want to make sure that our farmers are always profitable. We want to make sure that our farmers are always, you know, maximizing their profitability and making the next step within their operation. And so just a few things as to why are we so focused on sustainability today, right? Why has this come up? I mean, I think in the past 2 years, you know, sustainability has just popped up everywhere. You've seen, you know, non-GMO water. You've seen all of these things come onto the market. And so why are we talking about sustainability? Well, if you look on the screen, there's that one word, and that's the consumer, right? And so the consumers are really driving all of these messages. They want to know how their food is produced. They want to know where their food is produced. They want to know the finest details about all of their food production. And so if you take a look, 83% of people actually consider sustainability when buying food. Now, whenever I first started in agriculture, I would have said, okay, that's a New York thing, that's an East Coast thing, that's a West Coast thing. But what we've actually found is that it doesn't matter where you're at in the country, people want to know how their food was raised, and people are considering sustainability when buying food. So I think that that's a really important note to hit. But if we take a look at the bottom right-hand corner, 35% of people are willing to pay 25% or more for a sustainable produced product, right? So we have a pretty big gap between those people that want to buy sustainably sourced food and those 35% that are actually willing to pay for it. And so what we're trying to do at Land O'Lakes and what we're trying to do with these major CPG companies, so consumer packaged good companies like the Targets, the Nestle's, Kellogg's, we're trying to advocate for our farmers, for them to be able to get a premium for doing practices that are sustainable, right? And so today what we've seen is that consumers want to know, but they're not willing to pay for it. So in turn that creates a really big discrepancy with the CPG companies because they just expect the farmers to do these things at no cost. And we all know that a strip till machine is free, right? And so we're really trying very hard to make sure that our farmers are getting the best benefit out of, these partnerships that we have, so that way the companies like Kellogg's and Nestle's understand that these practices are not free. So the Land O'Lakes network, a lot of people say, well, why does Land O'Lakes do this? Why do they have this? And I always push back and I always say, well, why not Land O'Lakes, right? Because we touch 50% of the harvested acres, but the more important thing is that we are on 90% of the grocery store shelves. And so partnering with Land O'Lakes, you actually are a true farmer to fork business because we touch all pieces of the supply chain And we're able to tell that story to the consumer, to the CPG company. So if we move more into the carbon marketplace, right? So we can pride ourselves on being the only farmer-owned and farmer-driven carbon marketplace on the market today, right? And so being a Land O'Lakes member cooperative, we are farmer-owned, just like Twin States owns part of Land O'Lakes. And so why would a grower like yourselves want to partner with True Carbon? There's really 3 key reasons. And so if we take a look at the first, carbon credits require substantial data. You know, if you think about how much data is needed for a carbon credit, we're talking anywhere between 100 to 110 data points, right? And so we're talking about, you know, just the whole entire makeup of that field. So what was the tillage practice like? You know, when did you plant it? When did you harvest it? How many tillage practices did you make? Or how many passes did you make, right? And so all of these things have to be captured. And through Truterra and through the Insights engine, we're able to capture all of those metrics that you would need for a carbon credit generation. The second piece is that confidence in carbon credits are really key, right? So as you work with major brands, for example, our first purchaser was Microsoft. So as Microsoft came to us and they said, hey, we want to purchase these carbon credits, right? And so they wanted to know that they were buying the highest quality credit that was out there, okay? And so that means that they want to work with a company that is working towards the gold standard certification. They want to make sure that, you know, everything that we're doing is not only you know, validated and verified, but also of the top quality, so they can feel comfortable making those sustainability claims within their business. And then thirdly, the carbon marketplace is complicated. I mean, I think today you can comfortably say there's between 10 and 15 different carbon companies on the market. You know, you can look through all of those different contracts. Each one of them has, you know, some different terms. They all have different lengths that they are in terms of durability. And so all of those things really add up to why would you want to work with Land O'Lakes. And that's because we feel very comfortable that we have put the farmer at the forefront of our contract. We feel like it's very flexible for the farmer. We want the farmer to feel confident that they're not going to be locked into something for, you know, 100 years per se without any ability to make any changes. And so we feel very comfortable that our farmers are well taken care of within this. So if we take a look at what our offer was, and I say was because our offer has currently ended for this period, but we will be opening one up again at the end of this year. So now you have a time to think about what it was and then what the new one will kind of look like. And so our offer was $20 a ton, and we were paying it up front. So we were making a one-time upfront payment. That payment is going to be made at the end of August, first part of September. So for growers that did sign up with us, they were going to get that $20 a ton up front instead of breaking it out over several years. And we were paying on historical practices. So we did have that 5-year look-back period. So what those are called are vintage credits. And so if you had made a practice within the last 5 years, so a practice that had been changed to no-till or strip-till or reduced-till, if you had added any cover crops or started double cropping, all of those things would have classified as a practice change within the last 5 years. So that would actually qualify you for this offer. And then we also had no administrative fees. And so as we break those down, we'll get into it here in just a little bit. But the no administrative fees is really important because soil sampling is required for carbon credits. It's not a normal soil sample, right? So we're not taking just a nutrient soil sample. We're taking very specific soil samples. And so we're taking bulk density samples as well as soil organic carbon samples. And so those are two very specific samples that we take when it comes to generating carbon credits. The second piece is that we have no administrative fees, right? And so as you talk about how do carbon credits be verified, how are they validated, you have to have a third-party verification process, okay? And so that third-party verification can cost anywhere between $3,000 and $5,000 per farmer. And so what we have done at Land O'Lakes is we have actually absorbed that fee, and we will be paying for all of those administrative fees. And so that is another benefit of partnering through the Land O'Lakes network. So if we take a look at more of the historical practices, you know, what we really want to hit on is that we are paying for that carbon that has been stored in the past. We're not paying for future carbon. And so this is important because you now have the opportunity to get paid for something that you've already done. So within the last 5 years, you've already made this change. This isn't something that you're talking about adding anything new. This is something that you've already accomplished, and this is something that you can sell today, right? But the good thing is you can now sell your future credits. And so selling your future credits means that you can be in this contract, with us, where you've got paid for things in the past, but now you're also eligible to sell for your future credits. So you'd be eligible for the 2022 market as well. We do have the 20-year reporting commitment via the Truterra Insights engine. And so if we talk about the 20-year reporting commitment, this is what we call durability. And I know Jake's going to get into that a little bit, so I won't go too deep into it. But the durability for us is 20 years. This was a request from the buyer. So the buyer actually wanted to track these credits for 20 years. 20 years sounds like a long time. I can see a lot of looks on your guys' face like that's a really long time, right? And I would agree with you. But the reality is, as you talk about carbon markets, durability can go anywhere between 10 and 100 years, right? And so if you think about it, we're actually kind of on that lower end. But the good news is, partnering with us and through Land O'Lakes is that you're not locked into just selling your credits to only us. So we are buying just the credits. We're not buying the rights to future credits. And so that's really important as you start to look at the carbon market for yourself, because a lot of these contracts, if you have a 20-year durability, you're not able to sell your future credits to anybody else. But through our contract, we are only buying the rights to those vintage credits, and you're now eligible to sell to another buyer should you want to, right? Of course, you can still sell through us, but you can also sell to another buyer. So super important. And lastly, we have no financial repercussions if a practice change is made. So we understand that farming can be challenging. We understand that sometimes you just have to make a tillage practice, or you just don't get a cover crop planted one of those years. That's okay, right? We feel very comfortable that we've built in a buffer pool to where if you do have to do a tillage practice for 1 year and you go back to it, that's totally fine, right? There's no, you're not going to have to pay back any sort of money. You're not going to have to pay back any, of the money that we've given you up front. This is just part of being in the farming practice, right? And so if that happens, you just either, exit the contract, or you go back to that practice and you move on. We've already gone over the administrative fees, but again, that is really important to note as you work through, what does the other contract look like on the marketplace today? How are those structured? Because the administrative fees can add up very quickly. And so if you do have, those verification costs that are $5,000, and you have, a verification that has to happen 2 times through the durability, you could be looking between, $6,000 to $10,000 just on verification. And so you want to make sure that you definitely read the fine print as you're working through all of these contracts. So what we really want farmers to start thinking about is how you are generating, bushels of grain every year. You now have a new commodity, and that's carbon, right? And so every year you're sequestering more carbon. You now have the ability to sell, future carbon credits to a buyer on the market. And I don't want us just to think about carbon today. I think the future of ecosystem markets is water quality credits. And so you'll be able to sell water quality credits. You'll be able to sell removal credits. And so now you as a farmer will be able to sell, carbon credits, removal credits, water quality credits, and your actual bushels that you're creating on farm. And so this is opening up a whole new wave of profitability for you as the farmer within your operation. So if we take a look at the ideal field, there's a few things that I just want to hit on here. And we've already talked about it needs to be a grower that has switched to no-till, reduced till, or strip till within the last 5 years, right? And we anticipate that for our next offer, this is not going to change. So this will be, very similar for the offer that we'll be releasing in December. We're looking for growers that have added those cover crops or started double cropping within the last 5 years. Again, we don't foresee that changing. I would say that one's probably the more difficult task in this whole process. If you are doing a cover crop and you're committing to do it for 20 years, I think that's very important to understand, where that falls within that contract piece. But the biggest piece is that the field cannot be under a contract with another buyer, right? And so we say that because we have a lot of farmers that think, okay, great, like I'm just going to sign up with Truterra. I'll sign up with, another company, Nori, right, who we're also partners with. But the reality is you cannot double dip, right? And so you cannot sign up your field with more than one buyer. So if someone has already purchased those credits, then those credits are not eligible for sale again. The next question that comes up is, well, how do they know, right? So if we go back to that verification piece, that's how they will find out. Because once you're on the verification and you go through the verification process, those credits are then on a registry, right? And so that registry is a public registry that is available for anyone to take a look at. And so as buyers are making a purchase, they just validate that those credits have not been purchased from anyone else, right? And then lastly, we really look for someone that is the landowner, or if you're not the landowner and you are the renter, that you have an agreement with the landowner that says basically you're eligible to sell these carbon credits, right? And so you have to have that landowner sign off because it's more of a mineral rights situation, right? And so as we start to talk about things like removal credits, things like water quality credits, we're now getting into something very similar to mineral rights. And so that landowner does have to sign off on that. And we do have part of that written into the contract, but most landowners actually like to create their own process. So if we just walk through an example here really quickly, you know, we have a grower that has transitioned 1,000 acres into no-till 4 years ago, but they don't plant cover crops. Would this grower qualify? The answer would be yes, right? So yes, they would qualify. The estimated payment range. So if we just walk through this, we estimate that this grower will have sequestered between 0.2 and 0.5 tons per acre. Now I would say that the average farm across America is probably going to sequester about 0.4 tons. Maybe 0.5, 0.6 on the high end, but more than likely probably the average is 0.4. So if you take a look at that 1,000 acres, over 1 year they would be sequestering 200 to 500 tons. Okay, and then we take that times 4 years because we have the 5-year look back period, but they transitioned 4 years ago. So you'd have 800 to 2,000 tons. We were paying $20. So if you take that amount times $20, this farmer would be paid anywhere between $16,000 and $40,000 upfront, right? So this is a one-time payment that they would get paid at the end of August, first part of September. Okay. The other piece I would point out is with the data requirements. So there is substantial data. We talked about that at the beginning. It depends on what the buyer request is, but you always have to have baseline data. And so you have to have data that has happened prior to the practice change, right? And so with that, we've had 4 years of change. This buyer requested 3 years of baseline data. So that means we would need a total of 7 years worth of data for these carbon credits. So just really quickly, a few things on how we are different. So today, again, we've talked about this, but it's really important that you remember this. We are buying the credits. We are not buying the rights to future credits. So we are just buying, you know, those credits that you've already sequestered. Your future credits, you're still eligible to sell and make a sell to a different organization, or you can sell through us, but you still have that flexibility. So that's extremely important. And then if we just look at number 3, you know, we're paying for a practice change that has already occurred. A lot of companies on the market are asking you to add something in terms of, you know, adding a cover crop practice, making a tillage change. We are paying you on something that you've already decided on your own was a good idea, right? You've already decided to transition, and so now this is a good time to just go ahead and submit for these carbon credits because you've already done the practices that are required. So if we think about this, you know, just as we kind of close out, is this opportunity right for me, right? So if we take a look at these, you know, pieces on the screen, the 5-year look back period is really unlikely to increase. So we have a lot of farmers that say, well, I'm going to hold out and wait for a 10-year look back period. The reality is that's probably not going to happen. And the reason is because as you start to work with these major organizations like the Microsofts, like the Amazons of the world, they're not willing to purchase a 10-year look back period, okay? And so as you look at carbon sequestration in general, at about year 20 to 25, you actually kind of flatten out your overall sequestration rate. And so if you are, you know, paying for a 10-year look back period, they're not getting as big a bang for their buck as they are if they pay for the first 5 years. Because within the first 5 years, you sequester the most carbon. And so that's what they're actually looking at purchasing. So if you have done this within the last 5 years, now is a good time. Other programs are really 2 years look back and then forward looking only. So this is another opportunity for you to be able to get paid for something that you've already done. And then if you have 4 to 5 years of history, again, like we've discussed, now is the time to act, because it's unlikely that if you wait a few years, you would be eligible for a future program. So what does the future look like, right? And so at Land O'Lakes and at Truterra, we're really focused on being the carbon cooperative. We want to, we want to be able to have multiple offers within our Truterra Insights engine for you as the grower to be able to choose from, right? We don't want you to be locked into one program. We want there to be 4 or 5 programs for you to actually choose from. Perfect. So with that, I think we have a panel at the end, so we will take questions at the end, yeah?
Yeah, there's time for 1 or 2 short
Okay.
questions, but we will have a panel discussion at the end where all the speakers will be invited up and all your questions can be answered at that point in time. I also want you to understand that we're throwing a lot of information at you today. Everyone's going to, and maybe some of the stuff you've never heard. But that's the point of this meeting. The point of this meeting is an informational session for you to begin to understand what are these ecosystem markets, what are these carbon markets, do I qualify, how do I get paid, how much potential could I make to implement these conservation practices. So we know it's a lot to take in, but it's an informational meeting. Yes, sir.
Just a quick question on a definition for removal credits. I've never heard of one for removal credits where I've heard all the other credits.
Yeah. Yep, so removal credits would be nitrous oxide. So as you think about like fertilizer escaping greenhouse gas, that's what that would be. You'd be getting paid on greenhouse gas removal. Go ahead.
Why do companies need to buy these credits?
Yeah, great question. So companies are looking to buy these credits because they want to either make a claim to be carbon neutral themselves, right? So this is a way for them to be able to provide a marketing outreach to customers to say, hey, we're carbon neutral, or we're working our way towards carbon neutral. That's really the main reason. Some people are trying to avoid what is known as like a carbon tax, right? So they're purchasing carbon credits to avoid, all of the outputs that they're putting in. But really, a lot of it does come back to marketing.
And John Tinsman's gonna touch a little bit more on that here when he talks too. So thanks for all your questions. Joe Winchell is our next speaker. Joe is with Ag Outcomes. It is another group that we've partnered with to offer ecosystem services to our customers. So Joe's gonna come on up and he might start while I get his presentation loaded up, but let's thank Joe for coming.
Thanks, Jake. Well, I just want to reiterate what Jake said. Thanks for everybody coming out. Yeah, we were talking earlier and thought we were going to have early spring last week, right? Unfortunately, you guys got some snow. I live just west of Des Moines and we got vastly less snow than you guys got. I heard you guys got 3 inches, so that definitely doesn't help the situation moving forward. But I think next week's supposed to warm up.
Joe, that's okay. We want to slow them down anyway.
You want to slow them
I
down?
want to slow them down.
Yeah, next week's supposed to warm up. Grass will start greening up. It's gonna feel like spring. It's go time. So like Jake said, my name's Joe Winchell. I work for a company called Ag Outcomes. Ag Outcomes is a subsidiary of Iowa Soybean Association.
You're good, Joe.
And together with, you see in the bottom right corner, Ag Outcomes, and then together with the Reharvest Partners, we are the 2 entities that manage the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund. So, like Jake touched on, everything we've done to increase efficiency over the years in agriculture, is pretty astounding. My background before I came to work for Ag Outcomes and Iowa Soybean Association is I spent some time with Golden Harvest, Syngenta, as a seed rep. Before that, I was in retail. And so, been deep in the trenches on what's going on, how we've increased efficiency, how conscious we are about what our environmental footprint is. So these are all the things we're doing. We're boosting productivity, we're reducing livestock and fertilizer emissions, renewable energy, all that stuff. But this is where the attention's at, right? That's why Mariah and I are talking today. Because everybody wants to know about carbon. And so, what the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund does, it provides financial incentives to farmers who implement new conservation practices that cost effectively sequester carbon, improve water quality, and other environmental outcomes. We then take those environmental outcomes and sell them to both private and public entities. And so Mariah did an awesome job on Touch About Carbon. So instead of boring everybody with carbon again, I'll kind of tell you about how we're different. And I really take this away. Truterra and Soil and Water Outcomes Fund aren't necessarily competitors. We're really complement each other in a lot of ways. And that's how I kind of want everybody to take this away. And so, Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, we we stack a carbon payment on top of a water quality payment. So we know the same practices that we're asking to sequester carbon also improve water quality. They reduce pounds of loss of both nitrogen and phosphorus. It's the same practices that NRCS has been asking for years. They know it works. We just kind of go about paying for it in a different way. So these are the current counties in Iowa that we're eligible in. We have pre-agreements with companies like Cargill buys our carbon, City of Ames, City of Cedar Rapids, both buy water quality improvements from us, and so does IDOLS. And so we have budget commitments from them, and that's how we're able to take that, drive the dollars and cents down to outcomes per acre, and know how many acres and geographies that we need to currently work in. So currently we're asking for 85,000 acres in this area. Currently we're sitting about 36,000 acres are currently mapped in our system. Now that's not saying they're contracts, but those are the kind of acres that are somewhere either towards the end or just starting to begin the process of application. And so I get asked all the time, we got Hardin, we got Marshall, Jones, Clinton, these areas that aren't in the eligible counties. Why is that? Because the city municipalities that we work with, they're wanting to buy water quality improvements that are geographically pretty well located to them as well. So that's kind of how the water moves. We are talking to City of Des Moines. That's kind of pushing a rope uphill sometimes, I'll admit, but we are having positive conversations. That would kind of open up this whole area. We look at the Luss Hills. That's a lot of phosphorus loss just because of erosion. So pulling that piece in is really the piece that helps us scale up, but it's also some of the harder parts of getting those partners to work together. So eligibility. So say you're in one of those eligible counties, you have a field there. What's next? So the ability to add a new conservation practice to the field, i.e., reduce tillage, no-till, add a cover crop, those kind of things. We don't have a look-back period, so that's one of the parts where Truterra and ourselves really complement each other. If you have acres that you're currently been doing these practices on and they're not eligible through us, there's programs like Truterra, True Carbon, that is a really good option for you. So say you've been no-tilling, farming 1,200 acres, no-till, been doing cover crops on your 160 acres where you're capped with the NRCS. This would be a great opportunity to add a cover crop to that field, and then we can pay for the delta, the net change in outcomes generated by adding that additional practice. A lot of people I talk to, they're maybe looking at reducing their tillage already. They're saying, hey, we're chisel plowing in the fall, field cultivate in the spring. We're looking at maybe going to strip till or VT, mulch till, whatever it may be. Maybe we're looking at no-till on our beans, strip till on our corn. Every operation is truly different. Every operation is set up different. And so it's just not a one-size-fits-all. But those are the kind of things, the trains of thought that are leading people to being going into a program like this. We can't double up on the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund with other NRCS government programs because we do have IDOLS as a water quality buyer at the end of the day. And so if you do have a field that is currently enrolled or you are just enrolled it with EQIP or cost share program, we can't double dip those with what Soil and Water Outcomes offers. But then again, I go back to typically those programs are capped, and capped at probably a small percentage of what most people farm too. So I say, if you're doing that, great. Keep those acres there. This is a great opportunity to expand those conservation practices on the rest of your acres or some more of your acres anyway. We too have, so how we run the models, we look at an operational baseline and then a future projected new practices. So I'll go through an example of what it looks like on our website of enrollment. You'll enter, depending on your crop rotation, you'll enter a baseline rotation. So say you're a corn soy rotation, you'll actually enter 4 years of rotation, capturing 2 full crop rotations of what baseline data is. Now that's any fertilizer applied, any tillage pass done, any planting, and any harvesting. And then we set an intervention year, what the next year you're gonna have new proposed practices. So say we're going from full-fledged conventional tillage of chisel plowing in the fall, full field cultivating in the spring, and we're gonna go, like I mentioned, maybe someone's going to strip till and no-till beans, or whatever it may be, and then add in a cover crop in the fall. We will set an intervention year, and we'll be able to actually model the 2 scenarios against each other and see what are the pounds of maybe carbon emitted or carbon sequestered. What are the N and P losses there with the traditional practices? And then what are they with the new practices? And we can see how much more carbon sequestered, how much less N and P is lost, and see a delta there, and then pay for that delta. Mariah was pretty accurate. A lot of people are saying, oh, we're gonna sequester, 1 to 2 tons of carbon per acre per year. And I kind of shake my head and I don't know why we're saying that, because the beauty of sitting at ISA is I sit 10 foot away from one of the soil scientists at ISA that's also on staff at Iowa State. He's looked at this stuff a lot longer than most people in the industry have, and he just say, Joe, that's just not true. You're typically going to do, I would say, 0.2, a quarter to half a ton an acre per year, and then typically we're losing 40 to 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. So if we can reduce that maybe down to 20, maybe down to 30, there's a reduction of 20 pounds. We can put dollars and cents, that's worth it to the municipalities and IDOLs, and that's how we can pay for it. Yes, sir.
Question, so how do you model the farm or the field that's been no-tilling for 20 years, cover crops? I mean, so you're not gonna, your model isn't gonna show a change, is that correct?
Right, so that's why we pay for the new practices. So if you're already currently, say you're full-fledged no-till, you're full-fledged cover cropping, really the only thing we can do to increase that or better that environmentally would be, say, going to a perennial cover, like maybe a hayfield, maybe land retirement. That's why I say maybe that's the scenario where it would just be a better fit to go with Truterra at that point. So, our payment-wise, I would say everybody asks me, all right, I'm doing this, I want to do this, what would my payment be? I've seen payment range vastly because of soil type, because of slope, whether it may be manure as well. The beauty of what we're doing is it's very intricate because, like I mentioned, every operation is very different. So it can't be a one-size-fits-all program. What that also means is that every field, every farm could generate different outcomes. I just don't want to go and say, hey, if you're no-till and you want to adopt a cover crop, you're going to get $30 an acre. I've seen it be, sorry.
And Joe, you really won't know what you qualify for until you get this information put in the ag outcomes model.
Correct. And I'll go through that. I'll go kind of what the process looks like here in a bit, but it's $0 to $40. It's capped at $40. We did have a minimum here when we first started, the first few weeks, but then my boss and I were talking one Friday when we got done, and we're like, should we really set a minimum for what farmers want to get paid? Maybe I'm a livestock producer that, hey, I'm feeding cattle, and instead of chasing all these corn stalks and chasing these headlands, I want to seed down some rye, and I'll do it for $10 an acre because I was looking at doing it anyway. It shouldn't be up to us to say this is what the minimum payment would be, but this is financially what the maximum payment we can offer. So we'll go through the process, and again, there's no acre max, there's no acre minimum. I've had people enroll 15 acres. I've had people that are working on, they're doing 12,000 acres. So it really can fit. What I want to really drive home, it's really going to fit and tailored to your operation and what you're wanting to do at the end of the day. And again, there's no verification cost. So once you go through the process and you go to, on the back of that trifold that's on the table, go to the outcomesfund.com, there's a big green button, enroll now. Create a username, password. You can either map your field, upload a shapefile, and enter your operations. There's a clone feature where you can enter your operations. So say, your corn program's pretty well the same. I'm putting down 100 pounds of ammonia in the fall. I'm going to put down, some 32% with my pre, side dress it. You can copy those years on top of each other. So you can copy, say, 21 back to 19, et cetera, et cetera. Once that information's all entered and you submit your application, it comes to us. I look over every contract just to make sure all the data entered is actually true. There's nothing really goofy going on. And then I submit it to get run into the models. We get the model data back. We're able to drive dollars and cents to that. And at that point, you're still not committed to anything. You get a payment estimate sent to you. That would be a payment estimate for what you entered on your fields. At that point, you can decide to say, hey, I want to accept it. It's 35 bucks an acre, sounds good to me. Or maybe it's, it came back and, 12 bucks an acre just isn't worth it to me. You can decline it and we move on. That's perfectly fine. If you decide to accept the payment estimate, that's when we go through the HCL and wetland compliance with FSA. Once all the environmental checks are done, then we can send you a contract to decide, everything's golden, that you accepted the payment estimate, here's a contract. You can decide to accept the contract or, again, deny it if something had changed in the last few days or whatever it may be. So yeah, like Jake mentioned, you'll know what your payment estimate is after you enter all your information, but at no means when you submit application does that mean you're tied to anything yet. If you do decide to accept the contract, you'll receive 50% of that payment up front. So we understand there's costs associated with cover crop seed. Gentleman I was working with, he's adding another VT bar, so he said, hey, it's nice, I gotta buy a VT bar, I can put some dollars to it this spring. And then 50% of the payment is sent to you usually November, December timeframe. We do 3 field checks a year just to make sure, hey, what we said we're gonna do, we are actually doing. Usually that last field check, is after a cover crop to make sure we seeded it, maybe we got it growing, maybe we don't yet. But we'll get that second half of the payment there in the November, December timeframe. And then once you do that, we open the re-enrollment again for the next year, say in January, you'll have the option to keep re-enrolling. So it's a 1-year contract with the option to keep re-enrolling after that. And after your first year, we don't ask for any additionality. So say you want to go no-till and cover crop, and I'm planning on doing this for the next 10 years, you can just keep re-enrolling year after year after year. Some people have new hay fields that they're going to seed down here this spring. They'll enroll those. Say, hey, I'm going to have a hay field for 5 years. I'll keep re-enrolling it until I tear up that hay stand. So here's just an example. Rob, I hope you don't care. Of someone who enrolled their field. This is a new field they picked up this spring, where it's a new field, and do you know what the rotation was? Do you know what the tillage was? Yep, I know what the tillage was. Do you know what the fertilizer applied? No. But in that case, we would just put in the same for the baseline as we would the future, just so there's no effect there. But here's a field, it was no-tilled soybeans, all the fertilizers put up in front of the corn. So for literally a soybean year, we got no-till pass, planting, harvest. You'll see it when you do enter a field, we ask for a farm FSA and track number. That's how we do our HEL and wetland compliance with FSA. So that's why that's asked. Next, we get corn year. We're gonna strip till in the spring. So we got fertilizer tillage there happening on April 1. We're gonna put some starter down with the planter. So fertilizer planting on April 20th. We're gonna come side dress there in July, harvest. And so that's where we can take that and model that rotation over and over. And then all we're literally gonna do, we're gonna add a cover crop in both years where we're adding a cover crop fall of 21 into the soybean, and then again. So that's a screenshot of what the site looks like for anyone that wants to go on or maybe has already. That you'll see that's pretty familiar. And there's my contact info. So I know Jake mentioned we're gonna have a panel discussion later on, but any quick questions? Thank you.
We do have a few minutes for questions now, if anybody has questions. Yes, sir.
Does this program have the same requirements as far as the signing off of the owner as what Mariah was talking about?
No, but I would suggest just having a conversation.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry. Does the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund have the same request to have the sign off from the landowner? The answer is no. So you do have acres you're rented, whether that's a short or long-term lease. That's kind of the beauty of the one-year contract. If it is a short-term lease, I always tell people in general, have a conversation with your landowner, just let them know what you're doing. In my mind though, a landowner's probably gonna like the fact that you're gonna be doing some of these practices. You know, we're gonna reduce, you know, the landowner's buying this ground like many of you in the room for as a retirement investment. And we wanna protect the integrity of, you know, our property, of reducing erosion, whether it's wind or rill or anything like that. And so, you know, if your guys are getting compensated for some of those practices, I think it'd be probably in their best interest as well, but no, we don't.
About the different varieties of cover crops, the different grasses, does that make a difference in the payment?
So the question was, does it make a difference in the payment of the different varieties, different types of cover crop? It does take into account the growing season of that. Now I will say that if you have a cover crop, you know, in front of your corn crop, say you want to have something winter killed just so you don't have to manage that in spring, you can do that. Say oats, wheat, something like that. But it does take into account if you want to put a winter rye out there that's gonna grow after, you know, here now. Because honestly, most of our nitrogen, phosphorus loss, especially nitrogen, is happening basically right now. When we do have things warming up, we have a lot of moisture. We don't have a crop or anything, even grass in our ditches, uptaking it yet. And so it does take into account that. I go back to our cattle operation scenario. So say you want to put rye in front of your soybeans. You want to get out there and bale it or chop it, you know, let it grow up till May. And then you want to plant your soybeans after that. It understands the flexibility of that. So it does minorly affect.
Joe, I have a question,
Yes, sir.
specific to ag outcomes, what about, you know, we have some growers here from the state of Illinois. Do we see any structures like ag outcomes in the state of Illinois happening in a big way?
Yeah, so we do have 20,000 acres in Illinois. Again, the geography of eligible counties of that is more located towards around the Argo Ingredion facility, because PepsiCo and Ingredion and Nutrien are partners on that project, and so those are where those 20,000 acres are deemed eligible. Now, the plan and the hope and what I see happening is as these grow, we show, hey, we can financially make it more feasible for some of these partners who are wanting to go in on some of these ecosystem markets by saying, hey, you want to pay for water quality, here's your piece, do you want to pay for carbon? We can continue to grow these pilots and projects. And so right now, if you're right across the river, it's probably a little too far away, but if anybody would be interested to see that area, catch up with me and I'd be happy to show it to you. My 2 cents on where I really think this is going to go, especially on water quality, is from the federal side and energy, as well as carbon. The largest energy buyer in the U.S. is the U.S. government. If we can get everything kind of tied in and everybody to cooperate, that's where all this really grows, and I think that's where the things that are beneficial to the farmer the most.
And we can just print some more money.
I don't want to drive inflation more than already is.
Well, thanks, Joe. So we only, if you're confused now, Be prepared to be more confused, because as we go forward, we think these carbon markets in general are going to get more complex. And that's why, as a company, we're considering hiring a conservation agronomist or conservation agent to help our company and our customers wrap their minds around all these programs that are here now and to come. And to make sure our farmers understand, our customers understand, what's the best program to enroll in, how do I maximize my payment, X, Y, Z. So hopefully we have some help for all of us in the coming years here, so we can really get our minds wrapped around these things. And John is going to talk a little bit about kind of what, John and I have been talking to a lot of different groups, and John's going to talk a little bit about where we think the future may lie within the carbon markets and ecosystem markets in general. Thanks, John.
Hey guys, I'm probably a new face to a lot of you here. I came back to work for the family company Liqui-Grow 2 years ago. I came from Chicago, where I was a commodities trader. And now one of my roles at Liqui-Grow is to purchase all of the fertilizer inputs, things like the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, zinc, and sulfur, and make sure it gets to our locations on time when our farmers and growers need it. So, I'm honored to be able to play a very small role in helping your guys' operations run smoothly. And one of the things I've also been doing is looking into the very best way we can enable our farmers to be paid for environmental practices if they want to do it. So you guys have heard about the Truterra and Ag Outcomes programs, but I thought you guys deserved an explanation on why we partnered with those two programs out there. And so I extensively looked at the other carbon credit programs out there, and you guys might have heard of some of them. But I think the gist of it is, out there right now, I think these two programs are by far the most superior programs in the country, especially for growers in our geographic territories. You have companies like Bayer that are offering $10 an acre, but you need to have subscriptions to their software programs and their software data entries. And then a lot of the other programs don't have any buyers arranged. So things like Nori or Indigo or FBN, it's saying we're going to be more like a carbon marketplace, and so you're gonna make this carbon credit, but there's no guarantee that a buyer will ever come in and buy it. So you would be committing to these practice changes, in many cases signing long-term 10-year contracts without any guarantee to ever be paid for what you're doing. So I think we're aiming towards, and you can see in these programs, you get a large portion of your payment up front, and then you're paid in full, at the end of the season or at the end of the year. So I think that we're offering not only the most money per acre, and the Truterra offers a 5-year look back, but also the most advantageous terms without a lot of strings attached. And so just to go into a little bit of more detail, some of the two first programs were Indigo and Nori. And so it's potentially $15 an acre, but there's no minimum price guarantee. You're not going to be paid until there's a buyer that comes in, and then the full payment is made over 5 years. So it takes a long time for you to be paid for that. If you generate a half a credit per acre, like Joe was talking about, then that would mean you maybe get paid $7, or that would mean you maybe get paid $3 in your first year, $1 the next year, $1 the next year. And that's just for 1 year of practice. And it's also a long-term contract commitment that they're going to try to hold you to. And Nori's sort of the same way, and you'll have to pay $3,000 to $5,000 of verification costs every 3 years. So if you're doing something like 500 acres or 1,000 acres, and you're only being paid $7.50 an acre, you can see that verification cost would add up very, very quickly. So my advice to you guys, if you're considering something like this, is to find a program where you can get paid up front, at least in a portion of it, or with a prearranged buyer, so that you really believe that you will be paid. To avoid long-term practice commitments that you're going to be held to without any chance, or without the possibility of not being paid for continuing those practices. And then to seek being paid sooner rather than later. Obviously, you'd rather be paid within a year than within 5 years. And you guys need to, implementing these practices isn't free of cost to you guys. So you really need to make sure that practice change is advantageous financially for your operation. And then also you want to be paid obviously as much as much per acre without sacrificing any yield. And I think that's a big one, because even if you're being paid $40 an acre, if you're giving up 10 bushels per acre, that's going to add up really quickly. So we have Jake here studying how to not reduce any yield if you're going to switch to something like strip till, and he really is an expert in this area. And so here at Liqui-Grow, we're going to be able to give you guys the very best advice on, if you want to do this, let's do this, or let's test it out, but let's not reduce your yield. And let's make sure that this makes sense for your operation, and let's make sure that we can also improve your ground for the long term and limit erosion. Right, and another thing, I stole this slide actually from Trutera, but when we plug in your acres into the Trutera Insight engine, I thought one of the best things was it will tell you, with your practices, all of the FSA codes for your land. So you'll have it read out, and this is an example. I went through a training with Brent and Mariah where we highlighted land and put the practices into their software service. And then it would come out with these potential revenue opportunities. You can see there's crop rotation payments and pest management and nutrient management and tillage management, and this gives you all the codes. So if you're just selling the carbon credit to a company like Trutera, we're also going to be able to give you advice on how to maximize your environmental payments through your FSA offices. And I think that this is a really nice value add to your operations. And I think that everybody should take a look at it. And I don't see that there's any harm with sitting down with one of the Liqui-Grow representatives and plugging your acres in and seeing if you guys could maximize your environmental payments, especially for practices you might already be doing. Another reason I think to consider this is there's a lot of Fortune 500 companies right now that are pledging to their shareholders that we're going to be carbon neutral. And so you see 1/4 of Fortune 500 companies in the US. So that's companies like Exxon and BP, but it's also companies like Microsoft that are pledging to their shareholders that we're not going to have any carbon footprint, which means that they're going to be purchasing carbon credits from people like you that will be producing them in the future. Now, right now, they're not doing that, but they're committed at 2030 or 2035 to be fully carbon neutral. The only way for them to fulfill on these commitments, in my opinion, is to start purchasing carbon credits from people like you that aren't producing them yet, because that supply has to come from somewhere. And right now, it's not there. So I could see that carbon credits could increase in price if these companies do fulfill on their commitments. And also with the Democratic administration that's environmentally minded, I can see that there could be mandates towards purchasing carbon credits for certain industries. Right now, California mandates energy producers like BP purchase carbon credits. They have to do it by state law to operate in California, and so those are some of the big buyers right now of carbon credits. And and those policies could eventually move out of California into the rest of the country, especially if Democratic administrations or even Republican administrations make it a priority. And I thought I'd add this slide. So this is the carbon offset price, but you see that as they've been mandating these payments, they continue to go up. Now, if they go up at the same time as Fortune 500 companies are also buying these same credits, I think that the credit could, in the future, though it's just speculation, be worth much more than $15 an acre, or $15 a credit. And I also think that watershed payments could also be more in the future. So I think it makes sense that to try this out with a small number of your acres, if you're considering it, and see if it works and see if you can not reduce your yield but get paid to do it. And that way you'll be gaining experience for the future. And if the prices do increase and it becomes even more advantageous, you're going to know how to do it, and you're going to know how to do it well. And we'll be there to give you advice to have your best shot at making it work.
So we do have time for questions. Again, we will have a question and answer period at the end. But we do have time for questions for John, if there are any at this time.
Yeah, I've got one. If we're gonna start sequestering carbon now, and these companies are pledging to do this in 2030, are we gonna plateau on our carbon sequestering now, and then when they want to prove, well, are you actually doing it in 2030? We can't. We're already capped out, or we're already maximized. Are we getting too far ahead right now?
So I think that's a good question for Mariah or Joe. I mean, do you guys say if somebody signs up now, they're kicked out of the program in 5 years, Joe?
No, so we gotta look at this as what are we really sequestering right now? I live in Madison County, Iowa. We're 99% no-till. There's a lot of cattle, there's a lot of cover crops. But we look at the state of Iowa alone, we're 4% of our acres are cover crops. And 23% of our acres or less are no-till. So we have a long ways to go before we're ever gonna do it. And that's just Iowa. We look at Indiana, Illinois, Nebraska, Ohio. As a nation, we got a long ways to go, and the adoption, even when we're throwing dollars like this out, is not as fast as one guy might think or gal. So, because of that, we got a long ways to go.
I'll also add to that, even in continuous no-till, studies show it takes a good 25 to 30 years before carbon sequestration plateaus, and it also is going to depend highly on your soil type. So a soil that's already 3.5% organic matter is probably going to plateau sooner than a soil that's 1% organic matter. So it's going to depend a lot on your landscape, where you're at in the country, even in the state of Iowa, and what soil types you're on. But to add to Joe's comments, water quality initiatives, though, I think they could go on for a long time, right? I mean, so that's just a carbon piece, but there's also the water quality issues. And I think with time, folks will get even more and more concerned about those issues in society. So I don't see it going away anytime soon, I guess. Any other questions for John?
Yep.
How does usage of organic fertilizers meet the earth? How does it fit into this?
I actually haven't plugged in the use of organic fertilizers into the system. It should increase the payment there.
So Mariah up front said that it would increase the payment through Truterra, it sounds like.
Yeah, so you actually sequester carbon at a faster
Yeah.
rate using an organic.
Yeah, so Mariah said you actually sequester carbon at a faster rate if you use manure, for example. In addition to that, you're also not producing the nitrogen fertilizer, and it's also a slow release form of nitrogen fertilizer. So it makes a lot of sense that Truterra, for example, would account for that. And I was actually watching a Soil Health Institute webinar the other day, and they actually showed some of the modeling data for using commercial versus manure, and they did show that the manure sources, you've sequestered more carbon overall by using the manure sources.
The other day I saw the Biden administration wants to start focusing on carbon credits and start playing a governmental hand in carbon credits. What does that mean for these programs?
Yeah, they haven't released a lot of it, but they do have in their 90-day office commitment to start some sort of carbon offset program within the administration. We'll see what that is.
They did establish a tax rate on it for the penalty for methane and nitrous.
So the comment in the back there was they could implement some kind of tax write-off or tax structure for implementing these different practices that reduce nitrous oxide emissions or carbon, that practices that sequester carbon. And you're absolutely correct. I was on a webinar. It was an Indigo Ag sponsored webinar a couple weeks ago, and they had I think it was an Iowa Corn Association, a lobbyist on there, and what's being thrown around right now in the House of Representatives and Congress is they're potentially going to offer farmers a tax credit for signing up for these different ecosystem service programs. So in other words, you might get a payment from Truterra, But you also may get a tax credit if you're enrolled in TrueTerra or Ag Outcomes. Again, that's just talk right now, but essentially it looks like if that talk turns into reality, you know, there could be an extra incentive on top of these incentives to enroll in these programs.
Yes, sir.
If that happens, wouldn't there be a chance that they would, say a farmer who was signed up for CSP and he was doing the credits, that would be double dipping the government?
It depends on the contract, like with ours, you can do that. I think it just depends on what contract you're in. So with the TrueTerra program, you can do equip and CSP, then you would qualify for these credits. With the Outcomes Fund, because they are so closely related to the IDOLs and things like that, that's where you can double dip. So it goes back to all of those contracts and reading the fine print, because with some contracts you actually can do both.
But if the government starts paying for the carbon credits, the tax credits,
You should still be okay.
then it should still be okay?
She says she thinks she'll still be okay. And by the way, this is exactly why we're considering hiring somebody to focus on this, because there's going to be a lot of rules and regulations around these markets, and we think it's going to be really important that we have someone that understands it very well to answer questions for our salespeople and our customers.
And is there a danger of the standards or the expectations being increased every year?
Yeah,
Adding practices to it?
I think that goes back to you can only add so many practices, right? So yeah, I mean, if you want to continue to get a larger payment per year, you're going to have to always add credits. But there becomes a point in time where it no longer makes economic sense for you to add practices, I would assume, right? I mean, you could put your ground into a perennial forage crop or retirement to pasture, but obviously you're not going to make a lot of money doing that unless the payments become so lucrative that now it makes more sense for you to quit farming, I guess. I don't see that happening, I
Well,
guess.
that's where I'm at with CSP. I've been in long enough that the expectation for additional practices is almost prohibitive.
Right, sure. Yeah, at some point it would get to that, right? Yes, sir, Joe.
That's why I don't believe, personally, why we're not moving the needle fast enough through government programs like that.
Because they get so prohibitive.
Yeah, and acre caps, just those a lot of factors, but we're not moving the needle. That's why federal NRCS or RCTP or CPP has done what they've done.
Yes, sir.
So, TrueTerra question probably, you buy the credit, you pay the $20, it's on a rented piece of ground, landlord signs off, the operator loses the ground, and the new operator just starts smallboard plowing. What does that look like? Is that?
Yeah, so he was saying, for those of you that couldn't hear, so if you have a piece that's rented and then you lose the rented ground, what happens then, right? And then the new renter just starts plowing. So with our particular contract, we have built in that buffer pool. So we have a 20% extra buffer pool. So for example, Microsoft purchased 100,000 tons from us. And so that's what we went and purchased, or that's what we went and found from the farmer group that we have. So we actually purchased 20% over for cases just like this, right? So if the farmer does lose that ground, I don't want to say nothing happens, but at that point in time,
So sorry.
That's okay. The contract is then terminated, right? And then we just pull acres out of the buffer pool. So
So that's different than what I heard from another company is
Yes.
these companies were buying a particular acre carbon credit, and that's how they were paying it. So there is no buffer.
right, so it's very expensive to do the buffer, right? So if you think about it, Microsoft purchased these 100,000 tons, right? But then they also purchased 20% extra to have the buffer pool. So it's more costly than what they were, than if they were to just buy the 100,000. They actually had to buy 120% of what they were looking for to ensure that they could actually make those claims very confidently within the Microsoft organization.
So in that example, they're buying out of the pool, or are they, say this acre on my farm or anyone else's farm, is it applied, or can they identify that as a company? Is it identified as those acres, those are our acres, those are our
Yeah.
credit acres?
Yep, exactly. So if you sign up through Truterra today, right? So if you were to get the $20, those acres that you signed up for the previous credits would be identified through Microsoft as their credits, right? But the future credits that are on that field, you could sell to someone else. Like let's just say Amazon, for example. You could sell the future credit generation to Amazon. So your 2016 to 2020 credits would be sold to Microsoft. Your 2022 credit could be sold to Amazon. That make sense?
Great question. Well, last question, then we better move on to my piece, and then we'll have the panel discussion. Go ahead.
This is a Sarah question as well. When you do the look back of the 4 years and then 3 years prior to that, what kind of documentation is necessary to show what practices that you've done or haven't done?
Yeah. So very similar to the Ag Outcomes Fund. So we'd be looking at like the tillage passes, we'd be looking at the fertilizer applications, the harvest data, the planting dates. Do you have conservation practices already on these fields? You know, whether that be a terrace or whatever that is. Just very basic information that would relate to what you've been doing on your field. I'm very confident it's all information that you would all have, or Twin States would have in their database.
All right, we're going to go ahead and move on, but save your questions. Again, we will have a dedicated question and answer period. I figured there'd be more questions than anything. So, my name is Jake Vossenkemper. I'm the agronomy lead here at Twin State Liqui-Grow. I recognize about 75% of the faces in the room, so most of you know me, so I won't go into a long, drawn-out introduction of myself. But I guess there's a couple things I'd like to say. I already gave my rah-rah speech for the American farmer at the beginning, and I truly believe that's true. I think it's really astonishing what we've been able to do as a sector, as a company. And I truly mean it when I said that, I think we've taught the world how to farm, because I went to college 3 different times and in graduate school both times. At least 50% of my colleagues were from foreign countries. So we were teaching Brazil and teaching China and teaching the rest of the world how to farm in the American academic institutions. So we really have, what we've done here in America, we really have taught the rest of the world how to raise crops efficiently. So we have a lot to be proud of. Now, I'm going to tell a dirty little secret. Whenever this cover crop thing first came on scene, I was against it. I was against it not because I don't believe that cover crops and no tillage is a good thing for environmental stewardship. I was against it because up until recently, farming hasn't been all that profitable, and farmer debt was skyrocketing. And here, New York City, LA, Washington State, California was asking farmers to go above and beyond what they've already done for this country and the world, and now save the planet from global warming. And I was thinking to myself, how can a farmer at this day and age spend an extra $20 per acre on cover crop seed? How can a farmer do no tillage when in some cases no tillage is, doing tillage or not doing tillage is the difference between making a profit and making a profit or not making a profit, right? I mean, if you're not careful implementing some of these conservation practices, it can cost you big time. So I was just appalled by the fact that the American consumer would ask the farmer to implement conservation practices on their back when we're already the cheapest country to buy food in. It pissed me off, frankly. So I was against this whole thing from the beginning. And I even had a conversation with Scott Tinsman. I said, you know what? I said, if Nestle and consumers want farmers to be more conservation minded than they already are, they need to pay for it. I told them we should get Nestle together and Purina and Coca-Cola and say, hey, look, if you want farmers to implement conservation practices, you're going to have to pay for it. Because right now they can't afford to do any more than they're already doing. So, Scott, I was a man before my time. We had that conversation about 4 years ago. See, and here we are today. You should have listened to me. Oh, there he is. Now I have to eat my words because the American consumer or corporate America, however you want to look at it, does now want to pay farmers to implement conservation practices. And now I think at least now your costs are going to be covered, at least, right? But I still think we need to tread water before we swim across the ocean, because if we're not careful, that the $40 per acre that Ag Outcome is going to offer you, or the $15 per acre that True Terra is going to offer you, if you're not careful, you could lose that real quick. And not that I want to tamp the waters or discourage you, but I want to basically talk about some cautionary things that I would think about if you're going to implement some of these conservation practices. I'm going to focus on cover crops. I plan to run out of time, so I didn't put in a lot about tillage, but we can talk about that. We can talk about it in more detail during the question and answer period. Like John said, I do think about this stuff a lot. I do study this stuff a lot. I don't know everything. By all means, I don't know everything. You guys teach me stuff every day. And I think most importantly, what I'm going to share with you today is what we know today. Because cover crops are such a new thing in the Northern Corn Belt, there's a lot we have to learn. And because of that, I'm going to start to focus quite a bit on, cover crop implementation strategies, no-tillage strategies in our research that I do for the company already. So I will be focusing a lot on how do we implement cover crops and reduce tillage in Iowa corn and soybean productions without sacrificing yield. And maybe we'll find that we can even build yield with some different blends of cover crops. I don't know. There's a lot to learn, but I'm going to talk about some of those points today. So I guess just in general, prior to companies offering to pay farmers, of course, it made sense if you had cattle. My father-in-law, whenever I started talking about cover crops, he immediately reminded me, Jake, I've been doing cover crops for 20 years because I have cows and they graze this winter wheat in the wintertime. Okay, father-in-law, you're right. You're always right. I know. You've had it figured out for a long time, right? So if you have cattle, it makes sense, right? It makes sense today. I grew up in the Mississippi River bottoms. We have some really sandy soils in the bottoms. And guess what? We always planted winter wheat on those really sandy soils because if you didn't, that sand would blow away. So you had to keep the sand covered to keep the soil from blowing away. Again, really steep slopes, it makes sense, right? So there's reasons why cover crops made sense before today. But now that there's another reason to be paid for sequestering carbon, protecting water quality, now I think it makes a little bit more sense. And I might also add that in some of these soils with low organic matter or highly erodible soils, yes, by implementing cover crops, it is likely to increase your yields because you're going to be building soil organic matter or keeping the topsoil in place, right? But research also shows that if you already have 4% organic matter, from all that we know today about cover crops, if you already have 4% organic matter, it's not likely that adding cover crops is going to increase your yields. So I don't want you to have expectations that are too high, because in really good soils, there is no information today that would suggest that adding cover crops is going to increase your yields. Maybe they could reduce nitrogen loss. Maybe in the future we'll find out that a blend could increase soil biodiversity, increase yields. But today, there's not a lot of good evidence to say on a really good piece of ground that's capable of raising 250 to 270 bushel corn, it's not likely you're going to see a yield increase, particularly in the short term. Maybe 10, 15, 20 years down the road, but probably not after year 1 to year 5. Okay, so I think as an overall statement, I would say that to me it looks like a good time to start investigating these different practices. But if I were you, I would not, and this is the most important message that I'd like to deliver today, if I were you, I would not go all in on any of these programs today, especially if you haven't done cover crops before, or if you haven't reduced your tillage intensity before. I would take this opportunity to start investigating these practices if you haven't done this before. If you're an experienced cover cropper, sure. If you know what you're doing already, fine. I get it. But if you haven't, I would take my time. In fact, I'm going to pick on somebody in the front row here. Can I pick on you, Dwayne?
You always do.
Dwayne and I are good buddies, but Dwayne told me he tried this one time, and I think we had a dry year, and you might have lost some yield, if I recall, Dwayne. And I think you said, I'll never do that again.
There's more to the story than that.
Okay, so Dwayne says there's more to the story than that. So my point is things happen, particularly when this is a new practice, that can make us lose a little bit of yield, okay? But I think it's time to start experimenting and learn how to implement cover crops and no tillage in our current corn and soybean production systems. Okay, so another point I want to make, I think that if I were a farmer thinking about implementing these practices, I would probably focus on my poorest ground, okay? And that goes back to what I said before. We know for a fact, if you increase your soil organic matter from 1 to 2%, you're likely to have a big increase in yield, or at least yield stability, okay? So I would focus these conservation practices in places or on farms where you need to build organic matter to get yield. Because we do know that going from 1.5 to 2% organic matter, that is likely to contribute to yields. So I'd start small, and I'd start on your toughest acre where you're most likely to see the biggest yield impact. I would also start by planting cover crops in front of soybeans. In fact, I'm going to show you some data on soybean yields following a cover crop. And everything that I've read so far from every institution that's done this research suggests that that's the easiest place to start is in front of soybeans. So in other words, you don't often see yield decreases by planting a cover crop in front of soybean. And that's very likely because soybean doesn't determine much of its yield potential until roughly R3. Much of its yield potential. It does determine some before that, but a lot of its yield potential is determined after R3. And by that time, we ought to have the cover crop killed and out of the way, okay? Because we're looking at, the end of June, beginning of July before we get to R3, all right? So cover crops in front of soybean, that's a pretty safe bet. That's probably where I'd start. Okay, so what are the best options based on my research and reading to date for cover crops? Okay, Joe had mentioned that they don't have a lot of stipulations on cover crops. It sounds like every cover crop is kind of the same for ones that overwinter versus ones that winter kill. Is that right, Joe? So there's not the break point on what cover crops you choose to use is really, do they winter kill or do they overwinter? Okay. All these cover crops I'm going to talk about here, up top here, they all overwinter. Okay. And these are the 4 best options I think there are to date to get these cover crops established when we can actually get them established. Because then you're being honest with yourself, and you plan on raising full season corn or soybeans in the state of Iowa, you're probably not looking at harvest until mid-October roughly, right? It's probably not likely, unless you're flying this stuff on, you can get out there and get this stuff drilled or spread until roughly the middle of October. I mean, I just think to ask much more than that is unrealistic if you plan on growing full season corn and soybean. So winter cereal rye, winter wheat, triticale, and camelina are all cover crop species that will germinate at soil temperatures of 38 to 35 degrees. So that means these things can germinate a long time into November and maybe even December. So it might not look like there's much going on out there, but these things can germinate at really low soil temperatures. And that's why I think these 4 cover crops are going to be the easiest and most consistent to get established in the state of Iowa and Illinois today, okay? I think that the USDA, ARS, and many other groups are looking for alternative cover crop species, but today, those 4 cover crop species are going to be the easiest to get established, and they're going to overwinter, okay? And I think you can plant all 4 of those in front of soybean without any issue regarding soybean yield. Okay, we're gonna talk about corn here in a minute, but I'm just talking about soybean right now. I'm gonna tell you a little different story about planting cover crops in front of corn versus soybean, which is what I'm talking about right now. Okay, but before I talk about the soybean data, camelina is this cover crop here that I mentioned. These 3 cover crops are grasses. Camelina is actually a broadleaf. It's a mustard. It's in the mustard family. It's a brassica, and it's basically related to pennycress and canola. So pennycress, canola, and camelina are all very related. Here's actually a picture of camelina growing, so it looks like canola in the field at maturity. Hopefully you never see this if you're planting. Hopefully you never see this out of this crop, because that means that you didn't get it killed in time, okay? But this is what it looks like when it's fully flowered. This is the cover crop seed. This seed is 400,000 seeds per pound. This is the smallest seed. Teff is a little bit smaller. I think there's 1 million seeds per pound. But this is a really small seeded cover crop, okay? Which makes it very unique to us and our organization, because we can actually direct seed this camelina cover crop with our liquid suspensions. So we can actually blend this camelina with our liquid suspension and spread fertilizer and cover crop seed simultaneously with camelina. Now, I'm probably getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I'm 90% confident this will work. The last thing to do is, in my research trials, I'm going to ban and broadcast some of this camelina seed with liquid suspension to make sure that seed viability was not affected in a serious way. But I'm pretty sure this is going to work based on direct seeding with some other crops that are related to this one. So more to come on this, but I believe we can direct seed camelina with suspension fertilizer in the fall.
Is it easy to kill, and what's the resistance potential?
From my understanding, it is as easy or easier to kill than the grass species I talked about. I haven't seen a lot on how easy it is to kill relative to some of the other cover crop species, but we believe that it's as easy or easier to kill than some of the grass species, particularly something like cereal rye.
Seeding rate?
5 pounds per acre is the seeding rate on the camelina. So here's some soybean yield data. This would be, I want to point this out. This is specifically rye cover crop before soybean, okay? This is 15 site years of data in the state of Iowa. This research was conducted by the USD ARS, and basically the bottom line is there was almost zero yield difference average over those 15 sites if you did or didn't have a rye cover crop planted before soybean, okay? And this would mirror all the other data that I'm seeing from other universities that, you know, soybean are very forgiving. We can lose soybean stand, we can have early issues in soybean, and thankfully they're very good at compensating. So we're pretty safe for soybean. Here's another data set. This is actually some studies that were done by the Practical Farmers of Iowa. Some of this data also comes from Illinois. But basically here, now this is all cover crops. So this isn't specifically cereal rye. This is, I don't know what all cover crops were used, but it's not just cereal rye. There was other cover crops in here. But basically at 4 of these locations, there was actually a yield increase to using a cover crop in front of soybean. And I think one of the big benefits that we're getting out of a cover crop before soybean is actually enhanced weed control. I would speculate that that's probably why they saw yield increases in some locations, is because of the enhanced weed control you can get out of a cover crop species planted before soybean. So the other thing that I think's interesting is you're all going to think I'm crazy, but I'm not. I think you can even probably plant soybean into a standing green cover crop stand. I think if you have your planter set up right, which we're going to talk about, I think you can do this. I think you can do it successfully. That you may not want to try that year one, but when you talk to these guys, they've been cover cropping for a long time. In a lot of cases, you find that particularly for soybean, they're planting these soybeans green. And why is that? Because you can save a trip on herbicides. So if you're going to go down there and apply, if you're going to go out there and you're going to apply primers and herbicides anyway, you're probably already going to be using a PPO inhibitor because you need that to control water hemp anyway. So if you're using a PPO inhibitor, that's going to give you a good burn down. You're probably already using glyphosate. So between the PPO inhibitor and the glyphosate, you know, you make your one herbicide pass after you plant the soybean, burns your cover crop down, and you're off to the races. Otherwise, you got to make 2 passes. You got to go out there and burn it down at the end of March or beginning of April. Then you got to go back after you plant your soybean crop and apply your primers and herbicides again. Corn. Corn is a different animal. Corn is a different animal for sure. So, again, I think the odds of us getting a cover crop established, unless you're flying it on, before the middle of October is probably more, that's probably realistic to have it established, have it seeded by the middle of October. For these grasses in particular, there is definitely an elevated risk to reducing corn yields, okay? But there are some things we can do to avoid those potential yield losses, okay? First thing is cover crop selection. Winter cereal rye is really popular right now as a cover crop species. But you're also going to find, if you start looking at this data, that it's also the most risky. The reason it's really popular is because it establishes really easy, it's really aggressive, it's really deep-rooted, it really gets after the nitrogen, it really grows fast. So there's a lot of great traits about, and it's cheap. It's the cheapest cover crop on the market, all right? But it also has the highest risk for reducing corn yields. I just want to make sure I say that. So when you're sitting down looking at 12 bucks an acre versus 17 bucks an acre, it's easy to say, let's go for the 12 bucks an acre. But know that cereal rye is the riskiest cover crop species out there, all right? Winter wheat, as well as triticale, also has some risk to it, but not as much as winter rye. Camelina, I also like camelina because it's a really low risk option, okay? It may not be as deep rooted, it may not grow as fast, it might not be as vigorous as winter cereal rye or triticale, but it also comes with a lot less risk prior to corn because it's not a grass. When you plant a grass on a grass, you have something called green bridging with diseases, pythium from grass to a grass. You have some effects called allelopathy effects. You generally don't have that with broadleaves, particularly with brassicas. So I think camelina, although it might not be the best cover crop, I think is going to be a really good option to get started to not have any potential yield losses to corn, okay? Turnips, oats, radishes, those are all fine options. They're not going to hurt corn yields because they're likely going to be killed over the winter that you could also use. Oh, now this is scary. So this is the same USDA ARS study, only planting rye cover crop in front of soybean, okay? So this would be the yield increase or the yield decrease from planting a cover crop. And on average, over these 23 sites, there was a 5.2 bushel yield decrease when you planted cereal rye specifically in front of corn. And at 450 corn, that's $23.40 an acre, and there goes your ag outcomes payment or your Trutera payment, okay? I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm just saying that we need to learn how to implement cover crops into our corn production system before we go hog wild. This is the reality of it, okay? And I will also tell you that it's very likely that many of these guys who participated in these on-farm studies, they may have never planted corn into cereal rye before. They probably weren't using starter fertilizer on their planter. Their planter may or may not have been set up right to plant corn into a stand of cereal rye or a killed stand of cereal rye. So this is probably what you would find if you were a newcomer and you started doing this, okay? But I believe after talking to some guys who've been doing this for a long time that they have figured out a way to make it work without having yield losses. But I would be careful, particularly with cereal rye, okay? And we're going to talk about how you can be careful. That's basically what the rest of my presentation is all about. So this is the Practical Farmers of Iowa data set for corn. Now here there's 22 site years from 2009 to 2013. In this case, 3 of those locations there was actually a yield increase for planting a cover crop in front of corn, all right? But again, this is all cover crops, not just cereal rye. So I imagine that's why there's a difference between these two data sets. I would imagine that many of these cover crop species planted before corn in this study were not just cereal rye. I don't know what all cover crops were used. I wasn't privy to the details of the study. Now, here's kind of a funny coincidence. We're going to talk about this seed-in ratio thing here in a second, but I have a couple statements to make. So the problem with cereal rye is that it does a really good job extracting lots of nitrogen out of the soil, Jill. When this sucker, when you kill this sucker off, it's got roots down a foot deep and it's sucking up all the nitrogen. But the bad thing about cereal rye is it sucks up all the nitrogen. So there's no nitrogen for the corn, right? So a little bitty corn plant doesn't take a lot of nitrogen, right? But cereal rye is so good at extracting that nitrogen from the soil, it's taking up every little last piece of nitrogen left in that ground, and there's none left for the corn. When you add that on top of the seed-in ratio, so basically the seed-in ratio is really important because it's a predictor of, are you going to have nitrogen that's released from organic matter, or are you going to have nitrogen that's basically tied up when organic matter is breaking down? Okay, so you can see things. If the green bar is on this side of the graph, that means it's giving nitrogen to the soil. If it's on that side of the graph, that means it's taking nitrogen from the soil. Okay, so things like legume hay, if you work in legume hay, it's actually going to give you nitrogen. Okay, if you work in soybean residue, it's more likely going to give you nitrogen than to take nitrogen. But we all know that if you work in corn stover, what's going to happen when you work corn stover in the spring and then you plant your corn 2 or 3 days later? A lot of the times it's going to tie up nitrogen. Okay. These grass cover crops, it really depends on when you kill them. That's going to predict how much nitrogen they're going to tie up. Okay. So if you look at rye cover crop at anthesis, so this rye cover crop is beginning to pollinate, and if you let it get that far, it's going to tie up a lot of nitrogen. That's for sure. Okay. If you kill it in the vegetative stages, it's still going to tie up nitrogen, but not a lot. Okay. So the timing in which you get that killed is going to be really important for how much nitrogen it does tie up and how much nitrogen it doesn't tie up. So I think the thing I want you to take home from this whole conversation is, it's not that a grass cover crop is always going to tie up a lot of nitrogen, but it can, because it depends on when you get it killed, and it's going to be sucking nitrogen out of the soil, particularly cereal rye. So there's two things going against the corn crop. The cover crop's taking up the nitrogen, and it could be tying up nitrogen as well. So that means nitrogen management becomes early nitrogen management is going to become really, really important to that young corn crop. And that's going to be part of the secret to not reducing yields with a cover crop prior to corn. That's going to be part of the equation, okay? So on that note, go ahead, Dwayne.
Well, while you're here, I had a question for the end. I thought there's a toxin in rye.
Yep.
That the I can never say the word.
Yep, allelopathy. Yep. So allelopathy is a pretty long conversation, but essentially, to make it short, some grass crops, particularly cereal rye, when that crop basically breaks down and is degrading, it can release some natural herbicidal compounds called allelochemicals. We also believe that's part of the reason why we can see yield reductions in corn if you plant cereal rye before it. There's actually quite a debate brewing, Dwayne, whether or not that really has a big impact, but it's possible that allelopathy is a part of the problem. Okay, so that means if nitrogen is going to be a big part of the equation, that means that starter fertilizer or some fertilizer source that's readily available is going to have to become in part of the equation. Okay, and I'm going to show you a little bit of data on this after I generally talk through this. But I basically think you have about 3 options. Okay, I think at minimum, I'm going to show you some data on this. At minimum, you're going to have to put down 25 pounds of nitrogen and 5 pounds of sulfur with the planter. In other words, this nitrogen needs to be close to that corn plant and needs to be readily available. It needs to be protected from immobilization by that breaking down cover crop residue. So you can use straight nitrogen or sulfur, but I actually think it would be better if you went to something that had some nitrogen and P and K and a little bit of sulfur in it, because I think that these soils tend to be colder and wetter with cover crops, and that's going to slow mineralization of not only nitrogen down, but phosphorus down, as well as sulfur down. Okay, so I think at the end of the day, we're going to find out that an NPK sulfur blended starter is going to be better than just a straight nitrogen starter. But these are things that I'm going to be looking into and doing some research on going in the future. Okay, so here in a second, I'm going to show you some data on what we know today about nitrogen fertilizer applications, and it's important to implement cover crops, and we're going to go to that in a minute. But before that, I think one of the other things you got to think about is your planter set up to plant into a high residue situation, all right? And specifically I'm talking about, do you have good, easily adjustable residue management systems, all right? Right now, the residue management system on my planter, my research planter, is not easily adjustable. I gotta get down there underneath the thing with the wrench and frickin' change the height of my residue cleaners. And because I'm going from research farm to research farm, I'm always experiencing different systems, so I'm always have to frickin' change those things. And sometimes I go, you know what, I'm tired, I'm not changing the damn things. And that's gonna happen to you too, and you're gonna have to change these things a lot because you're gonna be in different, these cover crops are gonna grow at different rates, they're gonna be different stages, you're gonna have different amounts of residue to deal with. So I really think if you're gonna go serious into this, you need to get a good residue management system, row cleaners that are easily adjustable, and you can adjust them on the fly. Because I think that's a big part of this equation. Getting that residue out of the way so you can maintain planting operations is gonna be really important. I also think it's gonna be important to rethink your closing wheels. And I've learned about this from a cover crop route in Pennsylvania. You know, one thing that he taught me was, you know, these simple wheeled closing wheels are not going to work because is what you're going to find is when you have a cover crop out there growing, that cover crop's holding on to the soil. You're going to have clumps. You're going to have clumps that you're going to have to deal with, right? So these current, you know, simple furrow closers, basically they're just dragging loose soil back over the trench and packing it down, right? You're going to need something with a tooth on it that's going to help break that root mass off of that soil, so it can be dropped back down there in the trench. So I think some kind of tooth closing wheel system is going to be important. I don't have the answer on the exact one, but if I were you, those would be things that I'd be looking at is my residue management system, and am I going to get that furrow closed, and depth of seeding also. Many of these cover croppers tell you when they start cover cropping, you know, they don't get it in deep enough. They don't get the furrow closed. And stand can be a big issue. So those are things I think you need to think about. And the seeding operation is going to be really important to making sure you're adjusting your planter to make sure you can get this corn in the ground. Yes, Joe.
One thing I've also noticed on that closing wheel, why that's important to me too, you might close that trench, but there more times than not, because the cover crop is doing what we want it to do, it's leaving that big air pocket underneath where, you know, you're just not getting seed to soil contact. So like Jake mentioned, you want to break it up, and you want to actually not leave an air pocket around that seed.
Yeah. So maybe packing it in is going to be a little bit different than planting in a loose soil.
Correct.
So to think about that closing wheel system, and is it going to work in your cover crop system is important. I like the idea of you know, rigging half your planter with a different system if you're just getting going. I mean, I know it costs money to buy the different system, but if you think you want one, when you're doing your first 80 acres of cover crop, you know, outfit half your planter with a different closing wheel system. If you like it, outfit the rest of it. You know, that's an idea. All right, so starter fertilizer and yield impacts when you're planting corn into cereal rye. So this is a Purdue master's thesis that I just found the other day. He finished this study in 2018. So all these trials were done in 2018 at 3 locations in the state of Indiana. So what they did is they had a no cover crop control. So there was no cover crop planted in this treatment, and there was no extra nitrogen fertilizer applied with the planter. Okay. Here is the yield of the cereal rye, the yield of the corn following a cereal rye cover crop with no nitrogen applied 2 by 2. So you can see here that, you know, they lost about 12, 13 bushels per acre when they added the cover crop if they didn't add nitrogen fertilizer. Here would be planting corn in front of that same cereal rye cover crop. Now they applied 31 pounds of nitrogen per acre in a 2 by 2 band. So they started to recover the yield loss from having the cereal rye planted before the corn, but they didn't recoup it all the way. But when they used 63 pounds of nitrogen as a 2 by 2 UAN application, now they recovered the exact amount of yield they lost if they didn't have the cereal rye cover crop. They didn't get any higher yield, but basically they recovered that yield loss. So this is averaged over the 3 locations in that Purdue study. So I think, you know, as we continue to do this and we continue to gain more experience, I think you're going to see things like this. I didn't show you this data, but the USDA ARS has also done some of these studies, and they show a similar thing. Actually, using cereal rye, they found that by using nitrogen on the planter, they could recover most of the yield loss from planting the cereal rye cover crop in front of corn, but not all of it. All right, so I think this is going to be part of the puzzle going forward. This is a study that I want to walk you through real quick. I'm not going to talk about all of it. I want to point out a few factors. This is actually a study that the Fluid Fertilizer Foundation is funding. Twin State is a member of the Fluid Fertilizer Foundation. So we basically, us and other companies, fund a research fund through the Fluid Fertilizer Foundation, and we go out and seek academics or independent groups to do research on our behalf. And we do that so it's non-biased information that farmers can trust and rely on. Okay, so Twin State and other companies that manufacture fluid fertilizers paid for this research, but the Iowa Soybean Association, Joe, and Scott Nelson implemented the research on the Fluid Fertilizer Foundation's behalf. Okay, this is the first year of a 3-year study, so I hesitate showing you 1 year of data, but I think it's interesting. So as we continue to get more years of data, you know, look me up, or I'll be sharing this, I'm sure, at meetings and whatnot, and you'll learn what else we find. But the first thing I want to point out is every treatment here, this was planted corn after soybean, this is corn after soybean rotation. Corn was planted into a cereal rye cover crop. Every treatment had 150 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer applied to it. The study was all about timing, the study was all about placement and source, okay? So they looked at different sources of nitrogen and different places of nitrogen, different placements of nitrogen, all right? This treatment right here is corn yield following no cereal rye cover crop, so that's the control treatment, all right? This treatment is 150 pounds of anhydrous ammonia applied in the fall with cover crop, okay? This is spring anhydrous ammonia, 150 pounds applied in the spring with a cereal rye cover crop, okay? So in general, there was no yield increase or decrease for having the cereal rye cover crop in front of corn, so that's good. But look what happened when you took out 50 pounds of that nitrogen from the anhydrous. So this treatment had 100 pounds of anhydrous ammonia applied to it, plus the other 50 was applied 2 by 2 as a UAN band on the planter. So you got between 18 and 20 bushel yield increase by taking 50 pounds of that nitrogen away from the anhydrous ammonia and putting it on the planter. It's all about making sure that nitrogen is readily available and accessible by that young corn plant, because cereal rye and grasses in general do a really good job at removing nitrogen from the soil, and they can tie up residue when they're breaking down, okay? John Deere actually, as an option on their new 8XR tractors, I saw last night, they have 1,000 gallons of liquid fertilizer storage built into the fenders. So I think these equipment manufacturers are making it easier for farmers to do things like we're talking about today, right? So I think you will see John Deere and other equipment manufacturers continuing to innovate to make it easier for farmers to apply particularly nitrogen on their planter. This is another Purdue study I wanted to show you. I think you know, this does not come up in the conversation of starter fertilizer enough in general. We always get drier corn when we use starter, particularly a high rate starter. All right, so this is a Purdue study. This is when they used a high rate starter, which would be similar to that 30 to 50 pounds of nitrogen I talked about. There was a 2% reduction in corn moisture at harvest. At that propane cost, that was basically 10 cents a bushel. So at 200 bushel corn, that's $20 per acre savings in propane. All right, so that in itself would help you buy the attachments to put on your planter to put on this nitrogen. All right, so drier corn and savings on gas cost doesn't get talked about enough, and I think that's an additional benefit you're going to get by putting nitrogen and or other nutrients on your planter. We're kind of running out of time. A good thing you gave me plenty of time, other speakers. So I'm gonna hit this reduced tillage thing pretty quick. It's a fact that as you reduce tillage, you also increase carbon sequestration. Here's a study from South Dakota State University or North Dakota State University showing that. But the same story goes for reducing tillage as it goes for cover crops, right? There was a study published years ago where they looked at soil temperature and soil moisture conditions at the time of planting in many different no-till studies. And they found that there was a correlation between soil temperature and soil moisture at the time of planting or during the month of planting. So what that tells you is, and what they found actually is that when the soil is drier and warmer, a lot of times you get a yield increase from no-tilling. But when the soil is wetter and colder, oftentimes you get a yield decrease from no-tilling. Okay, so when I was a graduate student in Oklahoma, everybody no-tilled because it's always too dry and too warm, and no-tilling leaves a mat or residue that holds moisture in the soil. In Iowa, we have some soils that are going to be conducive to straight no-tillage, and we have some soils that aren't going to be conducive to straight no-tillage. Now, I get in trouble when I say this, when I'm going to show some data here in a minute, because I'm going to show some yield reductions in no-tillage. I get in trouble with farmers because they say, damn it, I've been no-tilling for 15 years and I got just as good corn yields as my neighbors. And I believe you. But I also believe that you figured out a way to do it and make it successful. Okay? But if you're going to start no-tilling tomorrow, there's a good chance you haven't got it figured out how to do it and you're going to be successful yet. Okay? So I believe you. I'm just telling you that it can be challenging. So here's a long-term study in the state of Indiana. This is the longest term study that I know of comparing fall chisel plow, spring strip tillage, fall strip tillage, and no tillage in a corn soybean rotation. So this says that if you're going to plant corn before soybean, that conventional tillage, fall chisel, and strip tillage yield about the same. And arguably, the soybean, the corn actually yields a little bit less, also planted in front of soybean. So in other words, you can maximize yield with no-till or fall chisel, and you might lose a few bushel if you're gonna no-till soybean, no-till corn in front of the soybean crop. But when you no-till soybean in front of a corn crop, so in other words, if you're in a continuous corn rotation, you no-till, they show a pretty sizable yield decrease for no-tillage, but the same yield for fall chisel and strip till. And I gotta tell you, I'm gonna show you another slide so it's gonna tell you the same thing. It's gonna tell you that strip tillage is gonna be the tillage system that's gonna be the compromise, like when you get married, you compromise. Strip tillage is the compromise between full width tillage and no tillage. And I think you're gonna maintain a lot of the benefits of no tillage by going to strip tillage, but you're going to get some of the benefits for doing full width tillage by doing strip tillage. So I really think that strip tillage is going to help you maximize your ecosystem payments. It's going to help you reduce erosion, which is going to keep nitrate and particularly phosphate out of waterways. It's going to help you get more money from a carbon sequestration standpoint, but you're going to have to buy this piece of strip till machine. You're going to have to figure out how to make it fit in your operation. And I'm not saying it's for everybody. I'm just saying it's something that you should consider, okay? And I do believe that because now that you're getting a payment for sequestering carbon and keeping nutrients out of waterways, this now makes more sense. Okay, before, was it cheaper to go out and buy a strip till machine or a chisel and a field cultivator? Probably. So, there wasn't necessarily a yield gain, excluding adding fertilizer to this system. There wasn't necessarily a yield gain, but there wasn't necessarily a yield loss either. So this is a study that was conducted by my alma mater, University of Illinois. This was a tillage by crop rotation study. So we're just going to look at the average over these 12 sites, but from 2008 to 2010, they compared strip till to chisel plowing in continuous corn, I might add. This is in continuous corn. Okay, and basically over these 12 sites, there was exactly a 1 bushel yield loss for strip tillage versus fall chisel and spring field cultivation. So basically, even in continuous corn, if done right, you can get the same yield with strip tillage as you can with conventional tillage. All right. So is this the future? Is strip tilling into your cover crops in the fall? Is that going to be the way we go? And then making another pass to freshen that strip in the spring. So in other words, you're doing your fall pass and your spring pass. Is that the future? I don't know. I think it has a nice appeal for potentially reducing the effects of yield reductions from cover crops, and I think it's going to help you maximize your conservation payments. I'm talking. I'll continue to investigate this, but I like the idea, that's for sure. If we take it to another level, things that we're playing around with, we're actually playing around with sharing RTK guidance lines between farmers and people who strip till, or maybe farmers who do no tillage. So in this example here, with this farmer, we applied the liquid suspension fertilizer in the fall on 30-inch bands. We then shared our guidance lines with the farmer. The farmer is then going to use those guidance lines to plant with, and he's going to try to plant back on that banded fertilizer band. In this scenario here, we did this up at Clear Lake. In this scenario, the farmer strip tilled. He gave us his RTK guidance lines, and we actually blew the fertilizer on top of the strip till bands. Another scenario would be we apply the fertilizer, you use our guidance lines, and then you incorporate in the banded fertilizer with your strip till machine. So these are things we're playing with. Chris is in the back room. He's kind of our innovation leader. Him and I have been working together a lot, trying to think, how can we marry these cover crop systems and our fertilization program. I think this is a really nice system if we can get it to work out. We've learned a lot. We know that it's possible, but you have to have RTK guidance, and it takes some conversations to make sure that all the systems are set up correctly to do it. But it can be done. I want to show you a video. Hope it's not too loud. I want to show you a video from our Roseville, Illinois location where we actually did this. It's pretty cool. Videos are all the rage these days, so I thought, why not share a video with you? So this would be a location where we're playing around with, basically in this situation, the competitive retailer actually put on anhydrous ammonia. It's not really a strip till operation, but the farmer plants back into it like it's a strip till operation. We said, well, can we blow suspension fertilizer on top of those strips and the farmer plant back into it in the spring? So we were testing this out down here, and here's kind of what it looked like. Oh, you can't see it. It's a problem. How come somebody didn't say something? Okay, now we can see it. So here you can see these outside couple drop nozzles. We're actually applying it back on top of those strip till berms, I'll call it.
What's the speed of the equipment?
Oh, I think he was probably running 13, 15 mile an hour, Chris. Do you know off the cuff? 18 mile an hour, Chris says. Play it one more time. You can see that it's not perfect, but I've been shocked with how good we can be with this. Chris, on average, down there at Roseville, we had some problems. We were averaging about 3 to 4 inches off the center of the berm. Is that right? So
those emotions, they were put on hold by time.
So Chris is basically saying that we found down at Roseville anyway that we could be 3 to 4 inches from the center of that strip till berm. And I'm only talking to you, Chris, because I don't know if anybody can hear you. But, you know, we're working on this. It's on the back side, I have 4 small plot locations where I've applied fertilizer at different distances from where I'm going to plant. And that's really going to tell us, you know, is there enough of a yield increase there, you know, versus what we already do? You know, is this something we really want to promote? Because there is extra work involved here for you and for us. So we don't just want to do this to do it. We want to have an economic reason to do it. So, you know, the first thing was, are there equipment limitations? Can the equipment actually achieve it? I would say in general we found out yes, the equipment can achieve it. The second question is agronomically and financially, does it make sense for our company or for you to partner with us on something like this? All right, so more to come on that, but it is exciting. And most importantly, I want to show you that we're always trying to innovate. We're always looking at new management practices and new techniques to help increase your bottom line on your operation. And this is one example of that. With that, it's probably time to get started with the panel discussion. Why don't we take 2 or 3 minutes, grab a quick bath. We'll open up the floor for questions. Who has questions? Yes, Dwayne.
So, I was told my airway is considered vertical tillage, but to me it looks a lot different than vertical, what I consider vertical tillage. But how does it fit in to, you know, the carbon credit?
Yep, so I'm gonna let Miranda and or Joe field this question because they would know more than I how they have these tillage systems bucketed in their programs. Thank you. The question was, I have an airway machine as my tillage tool. I think that classifies as a vertical tillage tool, but how do I know if my tillage tool is considered full width tillage or reduced tillage, and how is that classified in these ag outcomes and Truterra systems?
Thank you. So how we consider tillage is essentially the depth of incorporation. So when you go in and you want to enter a tillage operation, they'll first select no-till, which will then eliminate all the tillage questions about depth of incorporation, tillage equipment, etc. Then another option would be reduced till or conservation tillage. The next option would be conventional tillage. So where folks are looking at strip till, VT, mulch till, etc., we're really looking at something where we lump in kind of in the same category. A lot of these are basically what their job of that tillage piece is just sizing up residue for decomposition. Maybe some slight inch or 2 soil incorporation, but mainly what it's doing is depth of incorporation or sizing up and depth of incorporation, and that's how Comet Farm, that's how NTT look at it as well as how deep that tillage piece is going in the ground.
Same.
The depth in the airway does not determine the amount of residue coverage though.
So the comment was a depth on an airway does not determine the amount of residue coverage.
Do you know what an airway is?
No, sorry, I haven't run into one.
It's gonna be hard to answer me then.
Can you describe it for me, please?
Pardon me?
Can you describe the airway for me?
Do you have a comment? You want to add something?
Basically, if you're not disturbing your soil surface, it'd be no-till. If you are disturbing your
You've got
soil,
8-inch teeth that you can run at different angles to throw different amounts of dirt. The idea is to cover residue slightly for decomposition. You don't bury it or.
so it'd be considered like deep ripping. Deep ripping would be
No,
conventional tillage.
no.
So 8-inch deep would be in our mind, even in Comet Farm and NTT would be considered conventional.
So I think, Dwayne, I'm not an expert at this, but I think you have to enter a tillage depth. And
That's what he said.
yeah, so, but you know what the tillage depth is, don't you? With the airway?
The teeth are 8 inches long, but it doesn't.
But it doesn't go down 8 inches.
It doesn't rip the soil like
Right,
you're thinking.
right.
It penetrates, throws a little dirt on the way out. It's a high speed.
Yeah. It's going to be considered a vertical tillage tool. I just about guarantee it.
Yeah, you'd be fine.
Yeah.
I mean,
Great
you're
question,
the one
man.
entering your information. That's why it would be up to you to enter it how.
Yes, sir.
Yes, this
question for the two carbon programs. I variable rate my fertilizer and have for years. And when I seed cover crops, I just seed parts of the field. How does each of your programs take that into account?
So the question was, I've been variable rating my fertilizer for 30 years, and I only seed cover crops on part of my fields. How does your program account for basically seeding cover crops on part of your field versus the whole field, right? And you mean phosphorus and potassium fertilizer, I assume, when you say variable rate, right?
Yes.
So when we're enrolling a field, we have the option to either upload a shapefile or also draw a field boundary. I deal with a lot of people that said, I've been cover cropping my field boundaries, parts of it, etc. Because of the field boundary and we can draw that, I say, if we've been drilling and you've been seeding a part of the field, that wouldn't qualify since it's not a new practice, but we want to account for the new practice. We can go in and we can simply draw and say, you know, you have record and you're variable rate. I've been doing 40 acres of this 80. Then we can go draw in a balance of 40 acres, and that's what we would pay on. To answer your question.
Yeah, so for our program, you would do the same thing. So we would have the boundary, right, the master boundary, but because you'd be splitting it, we would then break it down into 2 management zones. Because we do have the look back period, you would be eligible for the piece that you've been doing the cover crop on, to get that payment, right? So where theirs is in terms of additionality, we would pay you because you've already been doing that.
But I do it by slope and soil type, not by half the field.
Got it, so yours is just more, I understand what you're
Give the
saying.
soil-
Yeah, I understand what
it
you're saying.
Really helps, and it helps
Yeah.
with water quality too.
Yep.
Because it's targeted.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. So we could absolutely accept that. It would be a bit more tricky. We could work with you, but the short answer is yes.
No more questions, huh? Oh, yes, sir.
What about requirements in the future? Are we gonna be all required to be buying carbon credits? Are we setting up to be in that situation? You know, we also use fertilizers, we use diesel fuel, so our industry here, is that gonna end up being targeted that we're gonna be penalized in this carbon market?
Nope.
Eventually.
I don't think anybody knows the answer to your question, but I'll tell you that what I think we know, I think it's gonna depend on the administration and how liberal the country gets, and I don't wanna get into a discussion, but I think that's true. And that's up to the voters, not me. With the current administration, what they're saying, based on lobbyists that I've heard talk about this, is that they're not going to mandate farmers to do anything. In other words, what they'd rather do is financially incentivize farmers to implement different conservation practices. And I think that goes back to the tax cut or tax break they would give to farmers if you enrolled in Truterra or Ag Outcomes or whatever carbon market you want to enroll in. You know, again, I can't say for sure, but that's what I've heard lobbyists say in different meetings. So I think that's probably the best answer to your question is what I've heard lobbyists talk about. But that's always possible down the road, and we've been talking about that for years. Since I've been involved in production agriculture, we've been talking about, you know, mandates and federal mandates, and it's happened in places in the country already, like Maryland, the Chesapeake Bay. Do what? Ohio, yeah. There are examples. Minnesota actually has regulations on nitrogen fertilizer now, so it's happened in parts of the country. I think it'll only be more and more likely as time goes on that it will happen.
There's another question, Jake.
Yes, sir.
So Minnesota has just enacted some low carbon fuel standards, and California's got some, and then if the RFS continues, how does the Outcomes Fund and the Truterra partner or work with those type of programs where you've got a fuel program and now an energy program?
I can answer it. Yeah, so we didn't.
Could you kind of repeat the question?
Yeah, so he's asking about low carbon grains, low carbon LCI, low carbon intensity grains, things like that, as it relates to ethanol. I didn't really get into that today, but just a few things that we are working on is you're gonna see come from us really soon is called True Grain, right? And that's exactly this. And so we're trying to figure out how do we get a premium for grain as it relates to carbon intensities and things like that. Now, where we have to be really tricky again with these contracts is some contracts do have written in there that you're not able to market that grain as LCI grain, right? And so there's still a lot of things to work through. In fact, I was at an ethanol plant on the Nebraska side a few weeks ago, and they're very much ready to move forward. The problem is California is not ready to move forward. And so California wants these standards, but they don't want to pay for these standards. And so they're kind of pushing back and saying, you know, until you're ready to pay for it, we're not going to provide it to you. So that's really where we're at. I think that there's a lot of work to be done. I would say maybe in the next 18 or so months you'd see something come from us. But you'll start to see us, Truterra, use True Grain a lot more frequently as soon as, you know, the next couple months.
Do you see that you might use the greenhouse gas side of it instead of the carbon platform?
I don't foresee that piece. I think that it will truly be more of the LCI, the low carbon, just because that fits more into like the GREET model and things like that. And so I think that it'll be, it'll definitely be the low carbon piece.
I agree. You know, that's where it goes back to, it depends on who's gonna make who do what. I have a friend that he manages 3 or 4 Flint Hills plants, and we talk about this a lot. You know, what would it take to get Koch brothers to, you know, wanna buy carbon credits, to invest in water quality, et cetera. And, you know, basically, you know, at ISA with our policy and our lobby, and folks that lobby and do things, and talking to Lance Lillibridge, who's VP of Iowa Corn, you know, someone's probably gonna maybe have to make somebody do something. I don't think companies are just gonna start volunteering on that front, but I think, you know, RFS biofuels is gonna be a pretty big player once that does happen, because I think it's going to happen, but when and who's gonna make it is the question.
So talk about the water quality and the carbon credits and how those, is that just an Iowa thing, working in watersheds in Iowa, or is that national, or?
It is not just an Iowa thing. I'll let these folks comment because they probably know more than me, but there are some other groups. What's that ESR, John?
ESMC.
ESMC is another group that's offering carbon credits and ecosystem services credits. In other words, water quality. Am I accurate in saying that?
Yep.
So there are other groups out there offering both. Do you have any comments on that?
So, like I mentioned, so we have 85,000 acres this year eligible in Iowa. We started last year with 10,000 acres. We increased, we got through RCPP funds and federal NRCS, they actually divvied off a portion of their budget saying we have typically had most of this budget going towards cost share programs and wanting to enhance water quality and our own nutrient reduction strategy. A portion of that budget was actually carved off for other entities to give them, try to say, hey, can we move the needle further and faster than what we've been doing typically? And then also, so we have 20,000 acres, like I mentioned, in Illinois. We have 10,000 acres in Ohio. We're working on trying to get a pilot in the Chesapeake as well as in area of Kansas, where the largest public reservoir in the state of Kansas saw their first algae bloom. The city municipality down the road saw that we want to try to, instead of having to increase the size of our plant and increase costs, how can we incentivize our farmers and our livestock producers and our feedlots upstream from, you know, letting so much of that get into the water system.
There was another question.
Well, I just had the Ag Outlook question. What's your look back in terms of new practice? If I'm a no-tiller, do I need to just till everything for 1 year and then I can go back into no-till as a new practice, or can I?
So the question was, what's the look back and how does that work? You know, example being, if you're currently no-till and you want no-till to qualify, do you just till it up for a year? And so when you enroll 4 past years, of data. And what we do is we take the 4 years and we replicate that scenario over and over and over for 35 years on both ends. So on a baseline and the projected new proposed practices. And so if you showed tillage in 1 year out of 4, we would replicate that year over year over year. I would say that no-till, reducing tillage is going to pay more. That's the beauty of it. The more you do, the more outcomes you generate, the more dollars per acre you can get paid. Tillage will get you paid some. Cover crops will get you paid a lot more. So if you're currently no-till and you add a cover crop, you're still going to be financially ahead, and I would say it's probably going to pay for itself still. So.
But you'll only be paid on the cover crop practice.
The new practice, because we model out what the current practices are, model out what the outcomes generated on future practices, compare the two. So typically you could be emitting maybe 0.25 tons of carbon per acre per year, and maybe we start sequestering 0.25. That's how we get to a net difference of half a ton.
Other questions? Yes, Lisa?
Can you just maybe say a couple words like, okay, they're here at this meeting today, they got all this information, they leave today, and if they're interested, what's the next step in the process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Lisa said, you've been at this meeting today, you may have some interest, what's the next step? I would say that number one, with Ag Outcomes, you can technically enroll by yourself. If you want our help, we're happy to help you, and we have at least one person that has been trained at a fundamental level on how to work the Ag Outcomes computer program. We will help you as much as possible. Keep in mind, we're getting ready to start a very busy spring, so you're going to have to be patient with us on the Ag Outcomes thing. Sounds like Truterra, you can't actually enroll in a program until December now, correct?
Yep. You can
So-
still do the insights engine though.
With Truterra, you can't actually enroll in a program until December, but we could go ahead and get your data in the Truterra system. That way, when December comes, all we have to do is basically do a submittal process and it's done. And I would say, again, let us get through the planting season with Truterra and let's get together. Hopefully, we have it's possible we're going to hire somebody to help manage this and help organize this. I will be honest, at the moment, there's not a lot of organization around this, but we wanted to get you together and have a discussion to get you thinking about this sooner than later, okay? So we can help you get enrolled. Be patient with us with the spring coming up, but once we get the crop planted, we can get more focused on helping you get enrolled. So yeah, that's what I would say. Hello. Yes. Sorry.
So
Yes.
One more question. Is it our actual results or is it a model of our practices? Like is it at the end of the year, is it our soil results, our soil samples that are gonna do it? Or the modeling of our soil practices that's gonna give us our score?
I think I know the answer to the question, but I'll let the experts answer.
So we soil sample 10% of our acres randomly. We also water sample 10% of sites that when you do enroll a field that has some tile questions. Is there tile? Yes. Is it random? Is it pattern? Depth? Is there surface intakes? Is there tile outlet? That helps us filter out what sites are good water sampling sites. That's again one of the benefits of sitting at ISA is we also have a team of water scientists. So we're collecting this data to build data over time to answer more of these questions. But for your answer, you're paid based on model results because we send you a payment estimate. We have some people that already have an accepted payment estimates prior to ever implementing anything. And so you'll know what you get paid prior and you get paid 50% of that up front. So we have to, for scalability reasons and everything, we have to use the model. And so yeah.
Yeah, so I would say with ours, we sample more than 10%. I would say we're probably closer to 50% of our acres. So we will be taking that bulk density, that soil organic carbon test, and then we will use the algorithms just like with the comment planner, the DayCent process that Ag Outcomes Fund's using. All of those other companies, the Noris, those are all using the same sort of process, but it is a little bit of both. So you'll have the soil sample process, and then you'll also have the algorithm that builds in to give you your actual tonnage.
I might add a comment about that. I was a little bit confused when You know, we had all these different companies that were offering these carbon credits to farmers. I was like, you know, who's regulating the modeling that's going into this? I mean, can Indigo just say, well, that's what you get? Can Truterra just say, well, that's what you get? And in reality, I've learned that basically they're all using the same model in the background. They might be using, you know, some different technology to get to the answer, but essentially the model that all these companies are using, from my understanding, is the common model. It's an ecosystem services model developed by Colorado State University. So it's a published model that was scientifically reviewed and accepted by the scientific community that says if you do this, this is the carbon sequestration or the greenhouse gas reduction you can expect. So they're all basically using the same models. It's not like they've all developed their own, you know, modeling around this. I will say though, to Truterra's benefit, they're working very close with the Soil Health Institute, is that
Yep.
right? And I know some scientists that work for the Soil Health Institute, and I know that Truterra is taking a very hard approach at really making sure scientifically that we are sequestering carbon and that farmers are being paid. To be fair to the buyers and to be fair to the farmers, there needs to be real science involved in how do we come to these answers. And I know for a fact Truterra is working with actual scientists to come to these answers because I know some of them. Yes, sir.
On the cover crops, so we talked about the payment of the cover crops. Can you describe the payment difference between, say, an oat cover crop that would be a winter kill versus a cereal rye that's a not winter kill? Are they equal or not equal?
From my understanding, I'll let these guys answer, but from my understanding, if it's an overwintering cover crop, the payment's what the payment is. If it's a winter kill cover crop, the payment is what the payment is. So in other words, there's two big buckets of cover crops. Do they winter kill or do they not winter kill? That's my understanding, but I'll let these guys answer to correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh boy. There's a difference. I really hate to speak to what the difference is just because there's so many, there is with yield, there's just so many variables that go into generating outcomes with soil type, slope. But yes, there is a difference because the longer you have a crop growing and everything, the more carbon you will sequester. But as far as our payment, you do see one payment. You don't see a carbon payment and then a water quality payment. It's all one payment when it comes to you. If you'd like to see the differences, you can, but what drives a lot of the dollars and what the big difference would be is in nitrogen and phosphorus reductions when having a cover crop that overwinters and growing longer.
Yep, so with ours, it doesn't really matter to us if it's rye or oats or turnips, whatever it is. We just would, just planting a cover crop is what we would consider. So we don't have any specifications as it relates to what that needs to be.
So with Truterra, you're actually measuring the carbon sequestration. So if you planted a cereal rye, it rooted really aggressively, you had a whole bunch of biomass, you're going to sequester more carbon than if you planted oats and it winter killed. So Truterra is physically measuring the carbon sequestration. Ag Outcomes is modeling the outcome. They're not physically measuring that, correct? So it's heavily based on models. Truterra is the background is models, but they're also taking measurements to verify the model outcome. And I think they'll make corrections based on the actual measurements versus the model measurements. And the reason I answered the way that I answered in the beginning is that I've actually downloaded this comment model and I've played with some different scenarios to try to understand it better myself. And when I enter different cover crops, I get about the same answer. In the outcome, I get about the same answer. So in other words, if I grew cereal, rye, or wheat, it gives me the same thing, unless I grow oats that winter kills, right? So it looks to me like, I just know from doing some modeling myself that, when these models are developed, they're imperfect, right? And so, they know that an overwintering cover crop will sequester X amount of carbon, but to be able to tell the difference with any kind of statistical preciseness, it can't tell between winter wheat or triticale, for example, right? So for right now, they're bucketing those the same. But it can tell the difference between carbon sequestration for oats that winter kill in any grass that overwinters. So I think right now there's some huge buckets in these models. And I think part of what Truterra is doing, and working with the Soil Health Institute, is they're refining these models. And I imagine Ag Outcomes is doing the same. So as we take measurements, we get observations, at some point in time, we probably will be able to say, if you want to maximize your carbon payment, you ought to plant this cover crop. But today, I don't know that the models are that good yet, would be the answer to your question. They said that's really fair.
And it's hard to, because it all goes back to the growth model that the model uses.
Yep.
And it's hard to tweak that.
Yeah, modeling is like, an ecosystem service model or a nitrogen model that some companies promote. It's basically worse than predicting the weather. And you know how hard it is to predict the weather, right? I mean, there's a lot of error associated with these models, a ton of error associated with the models. But that doesn't mean they're worthless. That doesn't mean they're a waste of time. That just means there's a lot of uncertainty. And the more data we can collect, the better we can train these models, and the better job they'll do predicting the future. Yes, sir.
So something kind of similar, I've got a question about, what about precision planting of cover crops? So we're gonna target a certain area out in the field. I raise a lot of corn on corn, strip till, no-till in the past. So I try to keep that old root ball, root mass, corn stock intact, keeps it from blowing. If I could go in between those rows with like a twin row planter, single row planter, and target that area, is there gonna be, I guess, both agronomically and for cover crop in a carbon system payment, is there advantages, disadvantages?
So are you talking about interseeding a cover crop into your corn?
This would be post-harvest, not pre-harvest.
Okay, so to answer your question, agronomically speaking, there are some studies being done on skip row cover crop planting. In other words, you're going to drill your cover crop, and you're going to leave the area in which you're going to plant the corn without a cover crop in it. So in other words, you're basically making an area of soil that doesn't have a cover crop growing in it. So that way it's easier to do planting operations in that strip come the next spring, right? So there is some studies being done on that, and they do show that that can help reduce the yield reductions from cereal rye, for example. So that is an idea being thrown out there, and that might be something that I look at in research plots to try to inform you how's that working out, right? So I think it depends, but that is being looked at, agronomically speaking. From a carbon sequestration point of view, I don't know how they would handle that.
No, it wouldn't. But go back to Jake's point, operationally, especially as you look at no-tilling and planting green, say soybeans into that, I've seen some folks that are trying either using the same drill or setting something up where you're going on 7.5, 15-inch rows and you're drilling your rye, and then you're RTKing going over in the spring and you're drilling in between that. Is it perfect? No. But if you're not drilling or planting your beans right on top of where your rye was planted, you're able to skip that and either crimp it or kill it. It's just the soybean, it works really well, but everybody has to see how comfortable they are and what they're willing to do.
I don't really have anything to add other than more towards the interseeding piece. We are doing some trials in eastern Nebraska on interseeding rye into corn, and we're just in our second year, and so we will be able to measure what that carbon looks like at the end of those.
It's got to help.
Yeah, that's actually the next iteration to all this. So the question is, can you start your cover crop growing in season when your corn's basically finishing up its reproductive growth period? And the answer is maybe, and that would maximize our carbon sequestration and maybe maximize your carbon payment. But man, that's a whole nother level of logistics, and there's a lot of questions to be answered, and I mean, those are things that I'll be looking at in my small plot research studies to help inform you guys, but it's another level. I don't think we're quite there yet as an industry or as producers from a large scale point of view, right? I mean, I think we got a lot to learn before we do that whole hog, I guess. But I like the skip row idea. That's an interesting concept.
Actually flying it on like late August ahead of rain, it works pretty well.
Yeah. So the comment up front was flying it on before rain can work pretty well. And I don't have a lot of practical experience doing that, but I think it can work pretty well. Sometimes the stand probably isn't going to be what you want, depending on if you did it before a rain or if you got a good rain. But it can work, particularly with smaller seeded cover crops. The smaller the seed in general, the easier it is to surface germinate.
In 2019, it actually took off and worked really well, and in 2019 it was very late and very cold, and by the time a lot of guys got the ability to do it with a seeder, they never even really got started.
So the comment from Bill up here in the front was, you know, the advantage to flying it on with an airplane is that, you know, you do have some more GDUs to accumulate, and you can get it off to a better start, which also can increase the winter survivability. So that's back to the whole point of, you know, when do you realistically think you can get it planted? You know, the guys up north at our Clear Lake and Hampton location, you know, they think the only option is fly it on, because, you know, they'll tell you they're not done harvesting corn until Christmas. So I think it's going to depend on the operation and how fast you can get out there and get it planted. But yeah, flying it on is definitely an option. We're also going to be experimenting and playing around with mounting some Gandy box air systems on our floaters. So in other words, can you broadcast apply cover crops with the floater at the same time you're putting on fertilizer? We're going to set up a few rigs, see how it works. If it works out well, we might set up a few more. So things as a company, you know, we're exploring to try to help our customers implement these practices at a low cost, right? Because, you know, by the time you buy the cover crop, then by the time you hire a guy to drill it, or you buy a drill, or you take the time to do it yourself, you know, you're not looking at it a lot. But if you can, you know, tag team the fertilizer application with the cover crop application, it just save you some money. Makes it more realistic.
What about that hydro seeding thing we talked about?
Yeah, he asked me about the hydro seeding I talked about. Well, talking about with fungicide or with,
Well, we talked about it there at the
with
office.
fungicide?
Yeah.
So another harebrained idea I have, which is just an idea, everybody calm down. Could you apply cover crop seed with fungicide at BT? Okay. I think with something like camelina and our liquid suspension, you can use clay to suspend cover crop seed in water, just like you can with fertilizer. Okay. So technically, you could apply cover crop seed while you're applying foliar fungicide at BT. Technically. You know, how feasible is it? We're going to try it this summer.
I want to try that. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, that's cool.
Is it time to eat, or what time is it up?
I got one more.
He's got one more question.
I just want to wrap up. As we're talking about, I think everything we kind of talked about today was what the opportunities are, how it works for you, and learning how it works in your operation. If you're not an ISA member or you don't know if anything's correct, talk to Whitley over here. She's our producer services rep for Eastern Iowa. There's a card, you can fill out your information. We can either sign you up or confirm your information. If you are willing to or wanting to talk to one of the research agronomists at Iowa Soybean Association, they'd love to do some trials with you, work with you on some stuff, talk about, you know, can we try this, can we do this? A lot of the stuff we're talking about today, I know those folks are chomping at the bit to want to try to go down this path and bring a lot of the information they've done over the last several years and keep evolving it from there. So talk to Whitley, talk to myself, and be happy to help you out.
Awesome. Well, one of my boss men over here in the corner says it's time to wrap it up, so we'll wrap it up. Thanks guys and gals for coming. I think this is a neat opportunity. I think it's really exciting time to be involved in production ag. You know, we'll see where this all goes, but you know, I'm glad you came and I'm glad you learned, I hope, and we'll see what the future holds.
Really want to thank everybody for coming. This is a interesting new topic. Obviously, from the size of the audience, you're interested. You're not behind. You're on the front edge. You're learning as you go. Here are the experts. Thank you for your presentations, experts. And very much appreciate you coming and appreciate your interest in looking into the future of something new, way to add revenue to your bottom line. There's box lunches on the way out, Subway. Feel free to ask questions as you want to the speakers. And mostly just thank you very much for coming and participating today.